we deplore people who don't pay their rightful taxes, don't we? We set out our position a year ago in the series on the American War of Independence, and we're sticking to it now. Just pay your taxes, for God's sake. French, American, what is wrong with you people?
But this is such a hostage to fortune when we get investigated by tax
That's true. So now, anyway, you have a flood of people moving into the cities, desperate for relief. But if they manage to get there through the snow, there is very little there for them, because France already is suffering from quite high unemployment in the cities. Because, as we said right at the beginning of the last episode, the Ancien Régime is a modernizing regime. We're living in the age of the Industrial Revolution. People are being weavers, artisans, are being put out of work by machines, by capitalism. And
by Britain.
And by Britain.
More specifically.
Yeah, because Calonne, who wanted to liberalise the French economy, had signed, this is very Brexit negotiations, he'd signed a free trade deal with the British. And he'd said this will give us the shock we need, a bit of competition, a bit of, a spur to our economy. A flood of British manufactured goods.
Cheap gloves and things.
Cheap gloves that are putting the French out of work. So over that...
That's what my ancestors made.
Really? So basically, your ancestors were responsible for the Day of the Tiles in Grenoble.
Yeah, we played on it.
Wow. Tom, you kept that quiet during that whole incident when 12-year-olds were being shot. But now you bring it up.
Oh, yeah. I'd actually...
That's the word. That's even worse. It's the indifference. It's indifference to the suffering you've caused. Right. I mean, you'd be better when you're true to your values, Tom, please. So over the winter of 1788, about a fifth of the population of Paris...
so that's what, about
100,000 people. So, or are receiving relief of some kind, war relief. So now we have the three movements that we talked about last time: the political and financial crisis, the kind of high politics, the cultural moment, the cult of virtue, passion, of living your truth, all of that stuff, and now the social unrest and the anger, desperation. So this is a lot of pressure on the Estates General, which has been called and is supposed to resolve all this. And the thing is, they've called the Estates General. It's going to meet the following spring, summer, dates feast. But they don't really know, as we said, what it is, how it will be arranged. There's no institutional memory of it, because it hasn't met since 1614, 15.
And the king has not decreed what it should be.
No. There's a flood of pamphlets. There's a huge torrent of argument in the final months of 1788. And what people want, if they are kind of reformists, they say the third estate, which is the Commons, representing the great majority of French people, should absolutely not allow itself to be outvoted by the clergy and the nobility. So the third estate...
So the clergy, the first estate, nobles, the second estate.
Exactly.
The massive...
Everybody else, yeah. The third estate, its numbers double, so it should be equivalent to those two. And they should all sit together so that a majority vote can decide the questions that basically should be out, even if its numbers are doubled, if it's outvoted by the other two chambers, if each chamber has basically one vote, then they'll all never be able to win.
And can I ask, with all this talk about the general will of the people, which is already becoming very current, is there already a sense that actually there shouldn't be three estates, there should just be the one national assembly, which could speak and articulate the truth of the nation?
Yes, and this is the moment when people start to say that. So people have not really been saying that so openly in 1780 or something. But now by 1788, they're saying it very openly. And the most famous example of that, actually, Tom, is a guy called Sieyès, Abbé Sieyès, Emmanuel Sieyès. So he is from a commoner family, and he had become a kind of church administrator in Chartres. And he writes a very famous pamphlet. If anyone has ever done this for A-level, they will remember this. He wrote a pamphlet called Qu'est-ce que le tiers état? What is the third estate? Which came out in January 1789. And it started with these famous words. We have three questions to ask. First, what is the third estate? Everything. Second, what does it mean in the political order up to now? Nothing. Third, what does it demand? To become something. So this sort of idea that the third estate is everything. And he says, yes, the third estate is a complete nation. He says there are 25 million of us. There are only 200,000 of them, nobles and priests. We don't even need them. He says, we are the nation. If we want a total rebuild of France, we can have one. If we lack a constitution, we must make one. The nation alone has that right.
And he presumably, he's a member of the first estate.
Yes.
And we talked in the previous episode that there are nobles, members of the second estate, who sympathise with this.
Yes.
Third estate. They would like to see their order, their estate, dissolved into the entirety of a single estate.
They absolutely would. Yeah, they would. So we'll see a very famous example, Comte Mirabeau, who is one of the most famous spokesmen of the third estate, but it's a nobleman.
And of course also the Duke of Orleans, again,
Yes.
the cousin of Louis XVI, who is a member obviously of the second estate.
And actually some of these people are very patriotic about their own estates. He says, here's an example. There's a real Peter Menace in that pamphlet, what is the third estate. He says, if the nobility and clergy, like me, want to become part of the nation, they must discard their privileges. And he says, people are always asking what place should they occupy in the social order. He says, this is equivalent to asking what place should be assigned to a malignant disease which preys upon and tortures the body of a sick man. I mean, that analogy, your opponents they're not even traitors, they are a disease.
Yeah, it's very familiar, isn't it?
I mean, that is very familiar and very disturbing. So anyway, Inham made this argument. Necker suggests a compromise, and he and the king issue a decision. The third estate will get its key demand. It will get 600 deputies, compared with the 300 or so for both the clergy and the nobility. Also, the third estate will be able to choose as its representatives people like Sieyès, who come from the other estates. So if you're, Tom, a liberal reforming clergyman like him, or a vicomte or whatever, and your own estate won't choose you, obviously, you could run in the third estate elections to get in that way. However, what Necker does not decide is whether the three estates are all going to sit together, which would allow the third estate to dominate, or whether they would still be stratified kind of hierarchically, including different chambers. So this kicks off these elections for the three estates, and they're very, very complicated, so let's try to steer clear of them as much as possible. Basically, it's a filtration process. You've got a parish assembly, and then a district assembly, and then a provincial
It
assembly.
kind of varies from place
It does,
to
it's
place.
all kind of random.
Yeah, very.
And all the time, people have been encouraged, and this is an amazing thing. The king says to them, I want to hear all your grievances. I want to hear all your desires. So actually, the idea that the elite and the regime is totally indifferent and out of touch is not quite right.
But this is the king. This is him playing his role of the father.
Yeah,
the father
patriot
of the
king.
nation.
I mean, that's...
Because, of course, I assume at this point, the implications of all this identification of the third estate with the voice of the people, they're not yet discussing what implications that might have for the monarch.
No, because they're all... By the way, they're all monarchists. I mean,
Of course.
There is...
I mean, that's taken for granted.
There is very little of a... I mean, certainly in the books that I've read, there's no mention of any overt republicanism at this stage. Their dream, remember, a lot of these reformers, is a British-style system, not an American republic. So the ordinary people are composing these 25,000 dossiers, they call cahiers, exercise books, you could call them,
Yes.
in which they basically are saying, well, I don't like this tax, I don't like the seigneur does this, I would love to live with this or that, or this is
Junior Hailstone.
but no one in Europe has ever, I think possibly in the world, has ever done an exercise like this before. It is a monumental sort of public opinion survey.
Does it help stabilise it?
Well, obviously the problem here is that it raises expectations that because it's unprecedented and extraordinary, it raises expectations no government, even revolutionary government, can possibly meet, because people then and now, they want impossible and contradictory things. They want more food, they want more freedom, they want lower prices, they want less government on their backs telling them what to do. They also want more government, a paternalistic government giving them who is always there and beneath them, this kind of thing. They're asking things that no 18th century can possibly supply, and that will create that stoking their expectations that guilt-ready. The dissatisfaction will explode in fury and disappointment very shortly. Meanwhile, even as they are electing their representatives and drawing the cahier, the disorder in France is growing. And again, this doesn't start with the revolution, it precedes the revolution. So effectively, I think what happens is as the snow melts, as the ice thaws, and people go back to the streets, and the food prices are still very high. So the disorder returns to the streets, and you get a series of reports by about March of food rioting across the country, all the way from Paris in the north to Avignon to Toulouse in the south. And in particular, there is a sense that in the countryside, which is most of France, authority is really breaking down at this point. So I know we've both read Sharma's book. He has this wonderful section, doesn't he, where he introduces this by saying the first mass casualties of the French Revolution of France's rabbits.
Yeah.
Because he describes how people they're desperate, they form platoons, and they go out with guns or whatever, or kind of bludgeons, like British schoolboys, and they're hunting game and rabbits and all this sort of stuff.
And this is in contravention of very restrictive game laws.
Yeah.
And actually, it's one of the stories of 1789 is the erosion of those game laws. And it's bad news for rabbits, and in a very short time it will be bad news for birds.
Right. Yeah, because when gamekeepers try to stop them and say, "Oi, this is the Seigneur's stuff," they just shoot them dead and continue. But you think the real victims in this are the birds?
Because they've remained victims. Because it becomes a kind of principle of the new order in France, kill as many birds as you like.
François Mitterrand killed a bird and is dead again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah, it's a slippery slope from bread riots to François Mitterrand biting the head off an innocent bird.
Oh no, what a terrible image. So there's a real sense of a power vacuum in the countryside. People are attacking granaries and bakeries. Towns, unable to defend themselves, are forming their own militias. Again, that's not good.
Yeah. It's all kind of starting to crumble. But you know what you need in a situation like this?
Tell me.
Massive riot.
Yes.
Dominating. Does such a thing happen?
It does. So it happens in Paris. And I think, again, what I said in the last episode that the French Revolution started in Grenoble. You could also say, I mean, if you want to choose an alternative date, it starts on the 28th of 1789 in Paris, not at the Bastille. This starts in a place east of the Bastille called the Faubourg, its neighbourhood, Saint-Antoine, St. Anthony. And there's a rumour that goes around. There's a big wallpaper manufacturer in town called Préveillon. And there's a rumour that Préveillon had gone to a public meeting and had said that his workers should live on 15 sous a day, the price of, which is now the price of a loaf of bread, one loaf only. And actually, he hadn't said that. What he had said was that if they sorted out the economy and liberalised the economy, there would be lower prices, and then with lower prices, there would be lower wages, and one day his workers would live on 15 sous a day because bread would be so cheap, or worse, let's go. Now, Réveillon is very well known in Paris. He had made his capacity as a paper manufacturer. Tommy had made a paper that was the first balloon, the Montgolfier balloon. And he had sponsored the first hot air balloons, and they had taken off from the yard of his workshop. So, you will see his name if you Google the first hot air balloon. He is like a really modern, interesting person.
It's kind of James Dyson.
Yeah, exactly. And he was
he's technology, the future of the...
He's a really impressive person, this guy really. He had been an apprentice pig worker. He had worked his way up, built his own pig workshop. By the 1780s, he's employing hundreds of workers. He's brilliant at making wallpaper and paper generally. He's so good he exports it to England, which of course, given that England is the sort of... it's called Newcastle, exactly. He's also a very paternalistic employer. He pays his workers well than his competitors, and he even pays them over that winter when it's so cold they can't work. He says, I'll sort you out. right? But because he's a capitalist,
He's a saint. A saintly figure.
A wonderful
like
man.
the end of a Dickens novel.
a lovely man, like Mr. Cheerable or something.
Handing it. Yeah.
Anyway, because he's a capitalist entrepreneur, basically everybody hates him because he represents a threat. He represents threatening modernity, putting sort of craftspeople out of work, like his rivals out of work. And so as this story spreads, people in the neighborhood say, yeah, let's go and smash up Réveillon's workshop. The first day they tried to do this, some of the local sort of politicians managed to turn them away. But the second day, the 28th of April, the crowd is swelled by unemployed dockers, and brewers, and tanners and things. And about 5,000 to 10,000 people turn out outside Réveillon.
And do you think this is partly like in the election episode we did a few weeks
Roughs.
back? People, they're told there's going to be a barn.
Oh yeah, completely.
Turn up.
Yeah, but but the thing about people hearing there's going to be a barn and turning up to see the fun of it or to join in is key to all riots and revolutions, right? So all these people turn up and they lay siege to his house and his workshop. He and his family manage to get away. What then happens is extraordinary. It takes these people literally 2 hours to physically destroy every trace of his house and workshop. They pile up literally everything. And I quote, the furniture, the woodwork, the doors, the linens, the stocks of paper, the carriages, even some poultry. And they set it on fire.
So we had rabbits, now chickens.
The captain from Strasbourg of the guard who came to try and sort of sort out the situation, he said he described 1,500 or 1,600 of the excrement of the nation, vomiting up brandy and presenting the most disgusting and revolting sight, because these people have found what they think is Réveillon's cellar. Unfortunately, what they thought was his wine cellar, he actually had thousands of bottles of very good wine they left untouched. What they thought was the cellar of his wine is actually where he's storing the liquids that they used to make the wallpaper. So loads of these blokes drink this liquid and they're found dead the next day.
So you can see why the French Republic celebrates the anniversary of the French Revolution on the 14th of July rather than
Yeah.
this
The excrement of the nation vomiting up brandy. Vomiting up pigs. Exactly. The city guards arrive too late to sort this out. As in Grenoble, they're pelted with tiles and stones by the crowd, and then they basically lose it and they start shooting into the crowd. And estimates differ massively, but some estimates are that 300 people, that's about the middle ground, about 300 people were killed, and that gives you the bloodiest day of the French Revolution until 1792. It didn't even happen.
So that's the September Massacre.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is a really, really serious business. But of course, completely eclipsed and forgotten now, because so much worse is to follow.
Well, and I suppose because the main event of the year is looming, or at least the scheduled main event, which is the meeting of the Estates General in Versailles.
So after the Réveillon riot, Paris becomes basically an occupied city. Troops are sent in. There are infantry patrols on every street. There are sentries on the street corners. There's cavalry riding up and down the streets. And to the horror of the Parisians, many of these troops are specially brought in. They are the French armies, German and Hungarian detachments. Basically, of course, in the 18th century, they often recruited troops from elsewhere. So to have foreign,
As the British did in the
as the British Hessians, so to have foreign troops in the streets of Paris for ordinary Parisians is very, very unsettling. And there are all kinds of rumours. There's going to be a coup, there's going to be an insurrection, something is coming. And then, as you said, Tom, at the beginning of May, the Estates General opens in Versailles.
It's all kicking off at Versailles, where the Estates General are meeting up. And Dominic, what happens to Sweetness and
Sure,
Light?
it's all fashion. You love a history.
It's all yeah, I do. I love a hat.
Yeah, it's all fashion. So in Simon Sharma's book Citizens, he starts this section with a guy called the Marquis de Ferrières. So he's a lovely French Revolution character. He wrote letters and stuff all through the revolution, so we know what he was thinking. He's a very cultivated, reasonable, public-spirited man from the nobility, Poitou.
Did you say survive?
He does survive it, yes. It's nice. He's a man of the Enlightenment. So he's kind of looking forward to this, and he thinks, brilliant, we're going to sort out France's problems. Listen, he thinks brilliant. He can sort out France's problems. But when he arrives in Versailles, what is on his mind is what he is going to wear. Because this is not a minor thing.
Of course not.
This is an important part of the ritual and politics of the States General. Louis has been giving us support, as has his courtiers. He's very anxious about this whole States General. His Queen, Marie Antoinette, thinks it's a terrible thing. She thinks this is madness.
She doesn't like Necker.
She hates Necker. She hates the idea of the States General. I mean, she's not wrong, right? She thinks opening the door to this, who knows where.
She's not untrue.
No. And Louis is very depressed. He's been spending lots of time messing around with his locks and stuff. And to run the whole thing, he thinks the ideal thing, personally, would be this guy who's 23 years old. He's called the Marquis de Courbevoie, and he doesn't know anything about politics, but that's fine. He's really interested in court dress. And he and Louis decide that they need to face this instability. They need to sort of reinforce a sense of tradition and of rootedness.
So he's like the guy that you love on Twitter, who's a big fan of the King's
Derek Guy, the menswear expert.
Yeah, the guy the way he wears his suits.
He would be a perfect person to run the Estates General. Absolutely. So the Marquis and Louis decide that the nobles will dress. They must dress up. They must wear gold-trimmed cloaks, black silk coats, lace cravats, and they have these special hats, which are made of beaver with white plumes.
I mean, beaver fur, not kind of literally.
No, beaver fur, exactly.
Because that would be horrible.
Yeah, it would be horrible. You're right.
Disemboweled beaver on there.
Of course, that would be ridiculous, Tom. Let's be frank. It would be absurd. Supposedly, these beaver fur hats are the same hats that were worn in the reign of Henry IV of France.
Who's the great hero, isn't he? He's the people's king.
He's the people's king. Now, actually, this is kind of made up. No one really knows what hats they wore, but they basically invented a tradition. So much of the French Revolution.
Well, you never get that in the House of Lords. So
Yeah.
God for that.
So the Marquis de Ferrier gets his cloak and his hat, and on the 4th of May, he joins all the other courtiers, and they do a procession, king and queen, through Versailles to the Church of Saint Louis, formal kind of blessing, basically, for the church service that's going to kick off. And it could not be more sumptuous. The streets are literally hung with tapestries, sort of draped over the houses, gobelin tapestries. There are big crowds cheering along. I mean, they are cheering Marie Antoinette and the king. They shout along with the king.
And so it's a procession that visualises notions of hierarchy.
It does. And actually,
the monarchy, the nobility.
It does indeed.
The clergy, the general matter.
It's a bad message to send. It's the wrong message. And actually, Necker said, could we not have the Estates General in Paris? Because he wanted to get it away from the court for precisely this reason, to avoid giving that impression. But no, they have it in Versailles, they have all their finery, and then come the Third Estate kind of trailing behind all the commons. And they have been forbidden from dressing up finely. They have been told you must wear plain black coats. So Sharma says they look like conventional apothecaries because they look very kind of sort of solemn. They look like Puritans from the Ladybird book about the English Civil War.
Yeah, well, kind of Dutch Burners in Rembrandt.
But there's one of them in particular who seizes the limelight. Sharma describes him as, I quote, a mountain of flesh and muscle, crammed with difficulty into black coat and hose. This huge face seemed to have been formed by some volcanic eruption to cool, possibly temporarily, into a crust of pumice, pitted with dark holes, scabs, and craters. A force of nature, pagan, dangerous, uncontainable, within clothes or custom.
So more bad skin.
Yeah, that's the key to the French Revolution, isn't it? Bad skin. And this monstrous figure is a fellow who I imagine you would really like this because you like Lord Byron, you like bad boys. He's Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau.
So I would say that the history of the French Revolution could be written as being about Gerard Depardieu characters.
Yeah.
So Danton would be another example. This is a man who would be played by Gerard Depardieu.
Totally. I suppose it hasn't happened.
And alternated with very thin
who are Robespierre and people of that. Yeah, so Mirabeau is such a When I did this for A-level, he seemed such a dull dog. Always talking about like
Constitution.
constitutional procedures and stuff. I mean, I just couldn't wait to get past Mirabeau and onto Robespierre and Marat and stuff. But actually, he's a tremendously interesting character. He's a really badly behaved, sort of posh wastrel.
But he's also got like your hero, Stanley Baldwin.
Yeah.
Because he's an enthusiast for writing pornography.
Yes, I would imagine Stanley Baldwin's work was a lot more tame than Mirabeau's. So Mirabeau was a great philanderer, which Stanley Baldwin was not. He was very profligate, again, a big contrast. His father had him put in prison. His wife took him to court.
So that's quite Marquis de Sade.
He's very Marquis de Sade-like, actually. He's writing this pornography, but he's also writing very vicious political polemics. So he accuses his own estate and nobility. He says 30,000 calculating vampires who have sucked the blood of 20 million Frenchmen. And it will amaze you to know that having written that, he doesn't manage to win election from the rest of the nobility. But the good news is that he can run for the third estate, which he does, and he's elected from Aix-en-Provence. The thing is that despite his appearance, he's basically a huge man when he's got this terrible skin and he's shouting about vampires and stuff.
Yeah.
But actually behind all that, he's quite moderate. So what he wants
a kind of British constitution.
He totally wants the British constitution. But
That's very sensible.
But he's determined to be seen as the supreme champion of the people in this whole. So when they have that procession, he walks the way, throwing his head back so that everyone can see this huge head, and sort of bobbing his head around in a slightly disturbing manner.
He's like Harry Maguire.
Yes, he's got Harry Maguire's head. Exactly. If you don't know who Harry Maguire is,
Harry Maguire crossed with the volcano.
Yeah. So people are interested in the football metaphor. My brother once described Martin Keown, the football pundit, as looking like a fish trapped in a meat ball. And that's Mirabeau's face. Right, a couple of other good characters from the Third Estate. We've got Sieyès, the abbé who wrote the What's the Third Estate. There's our friend from Grenoble, Mr. Meunier, first revolutionary. And there's an obscure young lawyer from Arras,
a young judge
called Maximilien Robespierre.
So he is the
thin, pale.
He's me.
Mirabeau. Thanks. I'd take Mirabeau, but I'd take him over.
Yeah, you'd rather be Mirabeau than Robespierre.
Definitely would.
I mean, it's terrible that my physical form is like...
Yeah, but Robespierre is more typical of the people in the Third Estate, because they're basically lawyers. Of 600 of them, 180 are lawyers and 220 judges and magistrates. So in other words, this Third Estate people, the commons so-called, they're not the common people of France. They are upwardly mobile winners. People who actually are not very representative of the mass of the French people, but people who are incredibly articulate and ambitious and suffused.
And resentful.
And resentful, exactly.
And resentful of those above them.
Yeah, and the trouble is that those above them don't make any effort to hide that they're above them or to include them.
Well, isn't that the whole point of the Ancien Régime? It's all about hiding.
Of course it is. So the very first, so that was 4th of May, the procession, and the 5th of May, they meet in the Salle des Menus Plaisirs, the hall of the lesser pleasures of Versailles. And Louis is on his throne, he's got Marie Antoinette to his side, there's a table for his ministers, then you have the benches of the church, the nobility, and then the Third Estate are all shoved down to the far end of the hall. And the king gives a speech, and he says, brilliant, you're all here, I've been looking forward to this, everyone
should have done it before.
Great. He does say there's been a lot of talk of innovations. I think this is much exaggerated. I don't want to hear any more of that. Then there's a strange business with his hat. So he doffs his hat at the end of the speech, and then the nobility doff their hats.
Their beaver hats.
Their beaver hats, exactly. Now the Third Estate are confused at this. Some of them take their hats off, put their hats on, whatever, their hats are going on and off. Yeah. And this is against all protocol. They shouldn't be doing anything with their hats. Louis is really confused. He has to take his hat back off again. They all start putting their hats off and then on.
But it's fine, because despite all the confusion, there's then a huge excitement of Jacques Necker giving a speech on fiscal policy and finance. So that must cheer them all up.
Well, everyone's really looking forward to this. So this is the moment when the great man, the Swiss banker,
Yeah.
is going to put everything to rights. And he stands up and he reads the first half hour of his speech. And then he says, listen, there's 2.5 hours more of this to go. I can't be bothered to read it myself. And he gives it to the secretary of the Agriculture Committee and says, you read it. And the guy from the Agriculture Committee has been chosen just because he has a very loud and strident voice. And he reads, and Necker has basically written an incredibly boring speech about the deficit, about finance.
Because the king starts yawning, doesn't he? And everyone starts falling asleep.
People fall asleep. Everybody says afterwards, oh my God, it's so disappointing. Necker is, what a useless person Necker is. I've totally changed my mind.
So a bit like the British general election, the recent British general election. Very significant, but boring.
So the next day, the 6th of May, they all have to arrive and they're going to begin their deliberations. First of all, the various estates have to be registered, have to verify their credentials. And when they all arrive, the king's men say, right, you're all going to go to your separate chambers. Nobility over here, nobility over here, third estate this way. And Mirabeau says, stop. We cannot go to a separate chamber. Because once we agree to that principle, the idea of all sitting together and us dominating is lost. We must verify our credentials with everybody else. And he's really passionate about it. And one of the deputies says he's like a ferocious beast, an enragé. He speaks in convulsions, his face is contorted, he spits out his words in fury. And that obviously is the French Revolutionary style. Everything is overwrought, everything is, you wear it, you wear your sentiments physically, and you turn your rhetoric up to the absolute maximum.
And yet there is also a sense, isn't there, that you're trying to emulate Roman stuff, a kind of Ciceronian,
Yeah, definitely there is.
formal and faintly chilly.
Well, I think there's a couple of things actually. So part of it is definitely these people who study classical here in the school. It's Robespierre. Robespierre, classical. They've read all the speeches, particularly Cicero, and they're obsessed with Cicero, copying Cicero's rhetoric. So they see themselves as the new Romans. But also there is an argument that it's been a great age the last 10, 20 years in France for the public theatre, popular theatre.
Well, we talked about how massively the theatre is in a couple of episodes
We did. And
with the Marriage of Figaro.
And yeah, the Marriage of Figaro is an example because the Marriage of Figaro is very emotional, tear-stained, over the top, fun. This sense of spectacle. And for the first time, really, politics is deliberately emulated. So there is a public gallery for the deliberations. The Third Estate are basically having a massive stalemate with the court and refusing to go ahead and be verified along with the other chambers. And this stalemate continues. And every day, people will get, thousands of people will get coaches from Paris come out to Versailles to watch the show. The most famous one is an English traveller called Arthur Young, who is one of the great go-to sources on the early French Revolution. He's quoted in every single book. And he gets a coach out there. He hears all the big names speaking. He's excited about all the oratory. And he says that the spectator, what's shocking for him coming from Britain, is that the spectators in the galleries clap and cheer and boo as though it is a play. And he says this is very bad. This is reducing politics to mere entertainment. But actually, this becomes central to the revolution. Emotional outpourings that are, and this idea of the orator who is copying Roman models like Cicero, commanding people by the strength of his voice. And Mirabeau had a really good voice. Perhaps bursting into tears while he's talking, which people think brilliant.
But also, presumably, it's because unlike in Britain, the House of Commons and the House of Lords have elections where people go on hustings. And so the traditions of political engagement are organic, they're evolved. They're not suddenly being portrayed to people as something new. But in this election, no one's seen anything like this.
Yeah, of course. They don't have regular elections. They don't have the throwing of dead cats and the attacks on halberds that are such an important part of the British Constitution.
And so there must be a feeling that they're kind of, Mirabeau and everybody else is kind of feeling their way into roles that have not yet been defined.
Yeah, making it up. They're making up what is politics.
And what is the style?
What is the style of politics? Exactly. And they're drawing their style of politics from the theatre, from literature, from the kind of cultural mood of the time.
And so this is clearly very much true of the members of the Third Estate, that they are playing a role simply by not moving, by sticking to their guns. What about the First and Second Estates?
Well, they've gone off to their own.
But they must be watching this performance as well and thinking, maybe we should join it.
Yeah, eventually. They don't join straight away, though. So there's quite a long... It's about a month before the first dribs and drabs from them come to join the Third Estate. So the stalemate is quite long-lasting. And all that time, the stalemate is being reported back in Paris. So Mirabeau, for example, is his mistress in the shop, which is very convenient for him because he writes letters to his constituents telling them what's going on. And they go to the printers and they're released in Paris before they even get back to Aix-en-Provence. So there's this stream of stuff. So actually, it's not just a theatrical event; it's also a media event.
Yeah, of course.
But the first sort of media-organized political event of its kind.
Because there's some things that Rob Darnton mentions about how people wear buttons with images of top political actors and things. So there is a sense in which the relationship of the people to the theatre can be mapped onto their relationship to what is going on in Versailles.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think there is a sense that it's an entertainment, it's a spectacle, it's a sport, it's a fashion. You know, all these things are
and of course it's of pressing importance because of the catastrophic state that people are in across the country and in Paris.
Absolutely.
As well.
So by the end of May, early June, there are really, really bleak apocalypse reports coming from the countryside. There are posters going up in Paris saying that if something changes, there are posters going up in Paris saying that if nothing changes, there's going to be an insurrection. You can imagine the scene, calling for an uprising, those kind of posters. And that lends an urgency to all this. So on the 10th of June, the Abbé Sieyès says, look, we cannot wait any longer. You know, the courts are determined to not let us sit on the estates. Here's what we do. We will give them an ultimatum. You come and sit with us. And whether they do or not, we will declare ourselves the National Assembly. We will be the sole representatives of the nation, and we will take the nation's fate into our hands. I mean, this is an unbelievable thing.
It is.
They're in Versailles.
Yeah.
The monarch is only hundreds of yards away in some other room, and they're basically saying, we will take this into our own hands.
But also they're laying claim to the sovereignty that traditionally has been that of the monarch.
Exactly.
So, I mean, at this point, I don't think they recognise it.
Well, I think they still think this is kind of going to be a rerun of Britain's Glorious Revolution. And it won't go too far. Eventually Louis will give in and it'll be all fine. I think a lot of them still doing that. And you asked, Tom, and I didn't answer it properly, for which I apologise to you, hand on heart, about the first two estates. Some of them are now beginning to come across. On the 13th of June, sort of breakthrough, some parish priests. And actually, you asked about the two estates. The first estate, the clergy, they are actually the ones who are closest to the massive ordinary French men and women, because most of the clergy are not archbishops with kind of sumptuous cardinal style robes. They're ordinary parish priests who are often very poor, and who actually understand the peasants better than some of the Third Estate lawyers, etc. So more and more of these priests come over in the next few days, rising to about 100 priests. And on the 17th of June, they say enough, time has run out, we are going to now call ourselves as it were, a National Assembly. The amusing thing is they can't decide what the name should be. So Sieyès says, our title, which will resound down the generations, is the known and verifiable representatives.
So this is very like us trying to decide.
Yes.
Episodes of our podcast.
It's actually like you wanting a podcast to be called Podpast, which is
I still regret that.
Yeah. Yeah, you were about to stick with that, and this is the first time I've ever heard you say that you regret it.
I just think it would be a very good name, but whatever.
Oh, sorry, you don't regret having come up with it. You regret?
No, not at all. No, I'm very proud of it.
Well, listen, I mean, when the rest of history is dead, you can do podcast, but I'm not doing podcast. So Mounier, the guy from Grenoble, he says that's a terrible name. They're known for our representatives. He says I've got a very catchy name. He's the Tom Holland of the Third Estate. He says I've got a brilliant name. I think we should be called the Legitimate Assembly of the Representatives of the larger part of the nation, acting in the absence of the smaller part.
No, I'm about compression. Podcast. Anyway, listen. Let's not get into that. Anyway, yeah. So they have a succession of terrible names.
Yeah.
But eventually they decide let's go for the National Assembly. Let's cut to the chase.
Now, there's a sense, I think, at this point of them self-radicalising, anything being possible. They say that basically all existing taxation is illegal because they haven't authorised it. But for the time being, they're happy to let the existing taxes continue until they have drawn up the new. Remember, they have drawn up the new tax system. So this is, as you said, they're seizing sovereignty. It's a really incredible thing. Louis is very, very deeply depressed during this. I mean, he's got, as you said, Tom, before, he's got quite large, he's eating a lot, he's messing around with his logs. He feels very sad that this is spiraling out of control.
And then the terrible thing,
Shock, yeah.
is the Dauphin, his son, much like his son, dies.
On the 4th of June, dies of TB, and actually dies, we won't go into all the details because I think it's actually unnecessary, horrible. But this little boy dies a very agonising, lingering death from TB.
He's just 7.
And Louis and Marie Antoinette are understandably absolutely distraught. And Louis, and in a weird way actually, I think almost all the history books, even the best ones, underplay this. They just say, oh, by the way, his son died, he's very upset and he withdraws. But I mean, this for him is a loss of unbelievable proportions, just horrendous.
Because, unusually for a French king, he hasn't had a mistress. He's very much a family man.
Yeah.
And Marie Antoinette as well is a very good mother.
Yeah.
So they are engaged with their children in a way that is unusual.
Of course, yeah.
But reflects the kind of sentimental ideas of Rousseau.
Yeah, absolutely. So he withdraws from public business. He physically leaves Versailles for his country estate at Marly, and Marly-le-Roi, and there he, is lost in mourning. So he's not taking charge of all this. It's spiraling out of control. When he finally rouses himself and comes back to Versailles, he has a big meeting with Necker and with his brothers, who are much more hardline than he is, and with the Queen. What on earth are we going to do? And Necker says, I think we should probably give in to the Third Estate at this point. We've got to meet them halfway. And Marie Antoinette and his brothers say, this business has got massively out of control. It's Necker's fault. We should shut all this down now. And Louis can't decide, so what he does is a typically lengthy bit of change, but not too much. It doesn't satisfy anybody. He says, I'll bring all the estates together in what he calls a séance royale, grand meeting. And I'll offer them some reforms, but they have to abandon all this rubbish and tosh about a national assembly. Now, this is no good. So, I want to have this big meeting, and they're going to have it in the hall. The hall where the Third Estate will be meeting, and they have to set it up. They literally have to set up the room. On the morning of the 20th of June, his workmen go in to build the platforms necessary for this meeting where he is going to lay down the law. Now, meanwhile, they put signs outside saying, the Third Estate can't meet here today, we're setting up the room for this big meeting. And he puts guards outside. The Third Estate all arrive to find the doors are closed and there are guards blocking the way and there are signs going up about a big meeting with the king, and there are hundreds of armed guards standing around blocking their way, and it is also pouring with rain, so they're all getting soaked and they expected to go into the hall and have their meeting. What are they going to do? And lots of them say, well, I'm not just going to go home to bed. I mean, we should have a meeting. We should have our meeting we should have our meeting on our own as the National Assembly as normal. And one of them, a man called Dr. Geek. Tom, you love this. A man called...
Well, I mean, it's. I love the way that much loved characters and indeed implements of execution are kind of subtly introduced in unexpected angled ways.
Yeah.
So what's the name of his doctor?
Dr. Guillotin, who his mind full of interesting devices, rational devices for law and order. Dr. Guillotin says, a friend of owns a tennis court round the corner. We could go and meet there. It's in the Rue du Vieux Versailles, Old Versailles Street. Now, often you read popular accounts and they say the tennis court was the royal tennis court at Versailles. That's not right at all. The game that is being played is a game called real tennis, jeu de paume in French. But it's not the king's court or anything like it. It's some friend of Dr. Guillotin's who owns the court. Anyway, they all pile into this tennis court. So a real tennis is a little bit like squash, but with a very hard ball. So it's indoors. It's kind of an echoey, very stark, like a squash court. They're all soaked with the rain. They all pile into this place. It's very it's very plain, very drab, very stark. But actually that kind of suits them.
It does, because it's classical, isn't it, potentially?
It is.
And it gives them a perfect opportunity to swear an oath.
Yeah, because Mounier, the man from Grenoble, he says, what we should all do is we should now swear an oath. Now, they've all used to this because the big hit painting of the last few years was by David, who you'll be talking about in a subsequent, later episode, won't you, one day, when we finally get around to finishing this huge French Revolution epic. David had done a painting of Oath of the Horatii about 3 brothers who sacrificed themselves for Rome, or offered to sacrifice themselves for Rome, sort of martyr patriots. And they all decide they want to copy this painting. So they swear an oath, God and the fatherland, they will never separate until they've written a new constitution for France. And they say, listen, we don't even need a palace or a courtroom, because we are the National Assembly, and the National Assembly will exist wherever we come together. And then they raise their arms, as in David's painting. They stretch out their right arms. Not often not a brilliant look, to be fair. Tainted by subsequent misconduct in the 20th century, but that's by the by.
But again, Roman inspiration.
They stretch out their right arms. They put out the other hand on their heart, and they swear this oath. A great act of theatre, again, classic act of theatre, inspired by, the media, by paintings, and the subsequent engravings that reproduce the painting.
There's incredible kind of meta self-consciousness about the whole thing.
There is, exactly. Everybody's, what do they call it? Cosplaying.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing, isn't it? They're basically dressing up and pretending to be Romans. The news spreads very quickly. They've sworn this oath in this tennis court. There are printed copies of the oath on sale in Paris the next morning. Louis's brothers and the other hardliners in the court go absolutely ballistic at this.
I love their solution to the whole problem.
Fantastic, isn't it?
The Comte d'Artois, he says, brilliant, I'm just going to book the tennis court.
He does. He books the tennis court to stop them. And the question that's on my mind that I haven't been able to resolve is, did he play tennis? Did he... once you book the court, you're mad not to use it. Right? What else are you going to do? Especially if it's raining. Anyway, the 23rd of June, 3 days later, is going to be this big séance royale. It's been summoned into it's going to decide this. And again, crazy. It's such a failure of statecraft, I suppose. He humiliates the third estate. The church and nobility are seated first. The third estate have to wait outside in the rain for an hour, and then they're brought in through a side door. When they get in, they find that Necker is not there. It is clear that Necker has lost the argument with the regime, and he is refusing to come and has been told to stay away. And Louis stands up, and Louis speaks for just half an hour. He says, I'll give you some of what you want. Taxes will now have to be approved by the nation's representatives, and I promise that the Estates General will meet regularly. But he says, this stuff about the National Assembly is gibberish and nonsense. I will not accept it. The distinction of the 3 orders of the state is not up for debate. We will have to, the clergy and the nobility must run their own affairs. They can't be run forward by the third estate.
Because, of course, if the moderate position is to implement the British Constitution, Britain does have that division, House of Lords and House of Commons.
Yeah.
It's not wholly reactionary in that sense.
Yeah, it's not wholly reactionary. They're going well beyond the British Constitution, aren't they? And they're going well beyond the American Constitution. So they're doing away with the checks and balances that are so important for the United States, because they're all about the general will, aren't they? Which is not something that the founding fathers in America would say. Now, had Louis said all this 2 years earlier, whole story would be different. But it didn't. And it's too late because, as we said, they've self-radicalized. So when he gets up and goes out after half an hour, everybody else starts to file out, and the workmen come back in to demolish the platform. And the third estate do not move. They're sitting there. They will not move. This is their hall, and they're not going to budge. And the Marquis was Reze, the guy who is the suits man. Yes, Derek Guy. Yeah, he's him. Yeah. He says to them, "You've got to go. Look, we're trying to clear the room. You've got to go." And Mirabeau, by his own account, which is self-advertising, says, "Go and tell those who have sent you that we are here by the will of the people, and we will only be driven out at the points of bayonets." Very impressive stuff. And the Marquis, he retreats because he's such a stickler for protocol. he retreats back, walking slowly backwards. It's made a very strange image. This person's given this man with a face like a crater has given this speech to him.
Oh, but etiquette is etiquette, isn't it?
It is. And then Louis, poor Louis, he's just not a hard man. He's not ruthless, because when the Marquis tells Louis this, Louis just says, "Oh well, let them stay. If they want to stay, let them stay."
Whatever. They do.
So it's a classic Louis. He sort of parades his authority, but then he never ever enforces it.
Gives in.
He always gives in. So the next few days, more and more people join this National Assembly from the clergy and the nobility, and then 27th of June, for only 4 days later, Louis does give in. His position is eroded. It's a classic example of how in revolutionary situations momentum is all. His position is eroded. He says, "Okay, yeah, I've changed my mind. I'll give up." He orders the nobility and the clergy join the National Assembly now. After all this, I've lost. There is an explosion of joy in Versailles, a very, very pleasing scene. So people are chanting, crowds are in Versailles and shouting, "Vive Necker, vive le roi!" And the balcony of Louis XIV's bedroom, which overlooks the marble court of Versailles, Louis and Marie Antoinette come out onto the balcony, and they pretend to look happy and to wave to the crowds who are shouting, "Long live the King." And actually, I always think it's a telling detail. People are very shocked at the appearance of Marie Antoinette. Obviously, she's a grieving mother.
She's grief-stricken.
And they say, lots of people said, she looks as though she's aged so much. Her hair is grey. She's not wearing jewels. She looks terrible. I mean, it's understandable. And she seems to be forcing back tears. And she brings out her children, Marie-Thérèse and Louis. Marie-Thérèse is 10 and Louis is 4. And she brings them out, which is the royal family have never done anything like this before. And the crowd go mad, they're cheering and all this kind of stuff. But I always think there's a sense, even here, that they have become prisoners of the crown. They're prisoners of the situation. They're parading to appease the crowd. Yeah, exactly. Now some people think, in fact lots of people think, this is probably the end of the story now. The French Revolution has come and gone. So Arthur Young, the traveller that I mentioned, famously wrote in his journal, "The whole business now seems over, and the revolution complete." But not everybody. So that guy that I mentioned, the Marquis de Ferrières, the noble Enlightenment guy, he writes to his sister the next day. He says, "We've come close to the bloodiest catastrophe. The weakness of the government seems to allow for anything. People speak openly in the Palais Royal of massacring us. Our houses are marked out for murder." He goes on to say, he says, "Everything may seem tranquil, but the troops are no longer obeying their officers." He says, "The Estates General of 1789 may be celebrated one day." He says, "but it will be by a banner of blood that will be carried to all the parts of Europe."
So would it be fair to say, Dominic,
Yeah.
that storm clouds really are gathering?
They are gathering, because in the next few days there are rumours that there are military units on the march out there in the provinces. People are swapping stories, and they're saying they've heard that there are tens of thousands of troops coming towards the capital from the frontier garrisons, and in particular German and Swiss troops who fight for the French king. Mirabeau says, does the king doubt the loyalty of his people? And Louis has to issue a public statement saying, these troops are to reinforce the troops already in Paris, which are proving unreliable, which is true. The French Guard and the Swiss Guard, well, the French Guard in particular, in Paris. There have been stories about them disobeying their officers, fraternising with looters, all of this kind of thing. And there is a sense, there's been more and more of these stories mounting, that the crowds in Paris are getting ever more radical, the rhetoric ever more violent. There's in early July, there's a story that the crowd sees as suspected police informants and beaten to death. There is this kind of latent simmering violence. And in Versailles, some of Louis' advisors say, I'm sure you gave it to the National Assembly the other day, but we have to, this is the last chance now, we have to act. We have to take it, this is the last opportunity we'll ever have to seize control of the situation. Sack Necker, put an end to all of this nonsense, use these new troops from the frontiers to secure the city. The question is whether the army will obey orders. The Royal Commander, the Duc de Broglie, says it's risky. He says if we get this wrong, we will not be able. We don't have enough troops to secure all of Paris, to fight our way through Paris. Other advisors say, so tellingly, get out of Versailles now. You don't want to be a prisoner. Let's go to Metz on the frontier out in Alsace. We're so close to foreign support. We can get foreign aid if necessary. Paris is gone. But then other people say, no, we can't do that, because if we abandon Paris now, we'll never get it back. And we'll be showing ourselves, that we'll be setting ourselves against the capital. We can't do that.
Right, and a king leaving his own capital to go and side with foreign powers is not a good look. Right, and that is true now. Of course, as we can see.
Of course it is, Tom. Of course, it's all so... It's so ominous, all of these conversations, because they're anticipating so much what will follow. But anyway, Louis finally makes up his mind, and he says, okay, I know what we'll do. We'll go with your first idea. So on the night of the 11th of July, the plan is set in motion. Late that night, out of nowhere, Necker is dismissed. Louis tells him, you're sacked, you are exiled from France, you have to leave the kingdom immediately, and you cannot go through Paris, you cannot visit the capital, you can't stop on the way, you must go to Switzerland. A noble deputy called Gaston de Lévis, who knows all about this business, he sends a warning to his wife who's in the capital that night, and the warning reads as follows: don't go out at all tomorrow. There will surely be a dreadful commotion, and one cannot know how things will go.
Dominic, what a cliffhanger. The clock is ticking down towards one of the most famous dates in the whole, not just in French history, but history. We'll stop the 14th of July, 1789, the day the Bastille falls, and we will be looking at that in our next episode. And if you can't wait, you know the drill. You can do it right now by joining the Restless History Club at therestlesshistory.com. But if you don't do that, it'll be coming very soon anyway. So we will see you soon. À bientôt.
Au revoir. So today, let's dig into what really happened in July 17th. And let's start by picking up from last week's episodes. So listeners will remember there was a social crisis born of the horrendous weather, the bad harvest, the hunger, the frustration, the fear that swept so much of France as people were being starved. There's a financial and political crisis that goes back for decades to do with the French government running up debts to pay for its foreign wars, the political system, unlike St. Britain's, not really having a mechanism that allows them to do that. France has been on the verge of bankruptcy. There is called the Estates General, this great gathering, the Commons, the Lords and the Church, which has then morphed into a National Assembly and basically made a move to take sovereignty from the monarchy. And we ended last time, 20,000 troops are moving towards Paris from the frontiers, many of them Swiss and German speakers, so feared and hated by much of the Parisian population. They are advancing on the capital, triggering panic in the streets of Paris. And there's a sense, when you get to the beginning of July 1789, everything's building towards a peak, the food prices are rising, the panic on the streets, the sense of paranoia is growing all the time. And people,
because famously,
yeah,
the bread price reaches its pinnacle on the 14th of July.
It does indeed. It does indeed. About 15 sous, having been normally about 8 sous. So in other words, bread has doubled, and for a lot of people that means destitution.
Cost of living crisis.
Cost of living crisis with knobs on. And a lot of people at this point, even though that cost of living crisis is driven by acts of God, which is to say the weather, people are already looking for scapegoats, and that is a real theme of the entire French Revolutionary story. So a deputy in the new National Assembly, a future member of the Committee of Public Safety called Bertrand Barrère, said on the 19th of June that the food shortage was the result of the disastrous projects of the enemies of the people, enemies of humanity, and they need to be discovered, intimidated, and punished. And there again, a real plea for orders to follow.
But brilliantly, there is a kind of, the people's here, rather unexpectedly, is a bank.
That's right. Yes.
Not what you see today.
Yeah, no, exactly. So this is somebody, again, we talked about last time, Jacques Necker, the finance minister, a Swiss Protestant. He's the one person that most of the French public view as their saviour. But, as we said last time, Louis has been losing confidence in Necker. And at 5 o'clock on Saturday, the 11th of July, Necker and his wife leave Versailles for good in a coach. He has been sacked by the king. In a very kind of underhand means, Necker was about to sit down to have dinner when he got a note telling him he had to leave France immediately and not go via Paris. He goes to Brussels, and actually Necker then does something, Tom, which I think shows that he, it'd be nice to
very admirable.
It'd be nice to sort of have a revisionist view of Necker. But Necker gets to Brussels the next day, and he writes a letter to the Dutch bankers Hope, and he says to them, I put up £2 million of my own money as security for grain shipments to the people of France. Even though I have been fired, I'm still good for the £2 million. I mean, that shows he's a pretty decent...
Admirable.
Yeah, decent fellow. Now, the king's advisors, they'd sacked him on a Saturday, but they thought they were being very clever. They thought that because the National Assembly would be on Sunday, there would be a reaction, and they would therefore be able to manage it. But what they didn't bargain for, they didn't think it through. Because on Sunday in Paris, a lot of people obviously not working, and they've taken to the streets. There are a lot of sightseers, there are peasants who come in from the countryside to kind of go into the city. And a lot of these people are gathered at what's called the Palais Royal, which is a part of the city, a great complex of sort of arcades, and cafes and shops, which is under the jurisdiction not of the king, but of the Duke of Orleans.
Right, and we've talked about that, haven't we? And talked about how, for instance, when we were talking about the abuse level of Antoinette, that a lot of this is coming from factions within Versailles, within the royal family. And the Duke of Orleans, he is Louis's cousin, and although he's absolutely committed to the cause, and he will end up voting for Louis's death.
Yeah, good man, I think.
But he, I mean, there's a sense in which even now there is a slight quality of the kind of the internal royal faction fight going on. But it's obviously spiralling massively out of
control, yeah. So there are huge crowds that have assembled in the Palais Royal, thousands of people. And the news arrives by about midday that Necker has been sacked. And the crowds are very cross and angry. And they're all shouting, and people are listening to... There would be a tradition of kind of orators standing up and giving impromptu speeches on the street corners and things. And by about 3 o'clock this afternoon, a large crowd, it's said to be thousands of people, has gathered around one particular cafe where a young man is standing on a table shouting at the crowd. The Café Foy, it's called. And this young man will be very familiar to people who've read Hilary Mantel's book, A Place of Greater Safety, because he's really the hero of that book. And he's called Camille Desmoulins. He's 26 years old. He came from Picardy. He's the kind of slightly spoiled son of a lieutenant colonel who'd sent him to Paris for his education. And at the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris, Camille had become great pals with a man whose name will definitely be familiar to a lot of listeners, Maximilien Robespierre. So they're a real sort of inseparable duo. And Desmoulins is not a deputy at the Estates General, but he's very much of that ilk. So he's obsessed with the Romans, with Cicero, with liberty, with virtue. He's written a poem, an ode to the Estates General.
So he's a very Sandbrook figure.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Yeah, great, exactly.
He's a kind of Shelley, isn't he?
He is. He's a wannabe Shelley.
Poets as the uneacknowledged legislators of the world.
Exactly. That's exactly. He's a young, long-haired idealist. He's everything I dislike in a man, Tom. And he.
I look forward to you being there.
Well, Sharma says he's an exponent of the breast-beating, soul-provoking declamation then in vogue at the Palais Royal. His style, a tone of virtue militant, mingled with the patriotic martyrdom exemplified in neoclassical history paintings in the salon and on the stage. So you can absolutely... The type, in 1968, at Columbia in New York or in Paris or at the London School of Economics, he'd have been the first one to do the sit-in or whatever.
Yeah, or 1848.
Yes.
I mean, he's there at the beginning of that tradition, isn't he?
He is indeed.
The long-haired poets throwing cobblestones.
Yes, absolutely is. So Desmoulins stands on the table and he says to everybody, Necker has been kicked out. You, the nation, we've been insulted. And he says, aux armes, to arms, to arms. And he supposedly he grabs the leaves from a tree and he says, let us all take a green cockade, the colour of hope. And he kind of wears these leaves. And everybody
that's
says...
a marketing strategy that doesn't work out.
No. And everybody at the time says, oh, brilliant, love it. And everyone's shouting bravo and people are kissing him and kissing each other. And they take kind of green ribbons or they take bits of branches or of sort of leaves and stuff, anything green. And then they go out into the streets of the capital, out of the Palais Royal, into the streets of the capital. Some of them are wearing kind of mourning clothes to mourn Necker's dismissal. They burst into theatres. It's very kind of just stop oil or something, isn't it? They disrupt performances. Yeah. They say, how can there's a crisis on, this is a moment of mourning. How can everyone should go out in the streets and mourn the departure of Necker. They invade a wax museum run by...
I mean, this is so meta.
Yeah.
So meta.
Run by a guy called Philippe Curtius. Now, Philippe Curtius is the inspiration. He is the patron of a little girl called Marie, who ends up becoming Madame Tussauds wax museum. And in the wax museum, Philippe Curtius Wax
Lots
Museum,
of heads,
they've got a head of the Duke of Orleans and a head of Necker. And the crowd grab these heads and they're kind of parading around in the streets.
I know.
It is very...
I mean, it's unbelievable.
It is. It's so bizarre.
So the whole story is bookended with heads.
It is indeed. So anyway, the crowd rampage through the streets, shouting and waving the heads and all this. And they get to the Place Vendôme. And at the Place Vendôme, some of these troops are there. They're the Royal Allemands. They are German-speaking troops, and they try to clear the square. And basically, this degenerates into fighting between these dragoons and the crowd. And the fighting spills over from the Place Vendôme into the Place Louis XV, which is at the end of the Tuileries Gardens. This great sort of garden. Yes, this great exactly. Yes, this great kind of pleasure park, royal pleasure park in the centre of Paris. Now, the gardens are filled with middle-class Parisians on a Sunday stroll. Women, children, families and whatnot. And the fighting, which it has now become, between the crowd and the dragoons, basically spills right over into the park, into where all these people are strolling. Total chaos. The crowd are grabbing things from kind of cafe terraces and throwing them at the soldiers. Chairs, kind of stones, bits of statues. And because as people are fleeing in panic, screaming and stuff, the word spreads around the city. The Germans and the Swiss have gone mad and they're trying to they're massacring the people. And at that point, another military detachment, these are called the Garde Française, so the French guards, they arrive on the scene to try and protect the people from the German and Swiss troopers. Now, the Garde Française are an infantry unit, and they are very different. They are young men. They are often provincial from northern towns, and they have proved in recent weeks extremely unreliable. So they have been pamphlets have been circulating among the French guards. We are citizens before we're soldiers. We are Frenchmen before we are slaves. In other words, they have been, as it were, they've been, I was going to say tainted. That's not the right word, but they have. The rhetoric of liberty and virtue has permeated them as it has so many other aspects of French life.
It's like the police taking the knee.
Yeah, they're the police
2000.
taking the knee, exactly. So together, the rioters and the Garde Française actually drive the cavalry troopers out of the Tuileries Gardens. And at that point, the royal commander in the city, called Baron de Bessenval, he gives the order to all of his troopers to evacuate effectively the whole of the city, rather than fight.
Because he knows he's lost it.
Because he's frightened, rightly, that he says we cannot trust our own soldiers to hold the line. They are breaking and defecting to the rioters. So in that moment, the city is lost to the authorities. And that then is the cue for a kind of, well, there's no other way of putting it, an orgy of destruction, Tom. So,
or a toppling of symbols of oppression,
a carnival of liberation,
tyranny,
a carnival of liberation. So so as the royal troops withdraw to the Pont de Sèvres, a bridge to the west, the crowd invades gun shops, armourers, and so on, and they force them to hand over whatever weapons they can find. They've also, many of them by now, armed themselves with daggers and clubs, even kitchen knives. And they head to the north of the city, where there is this great wall, a customs barrier. Because remember, we said in a previous episode, France at this point has a lot of internal duties, internal economic barriers, protectionist barriers and literally customs barriers. And this is the most famous one.
And it's built by Lavoisier, who is the greatest chemist in France. And he has done it because he has invested in this kind of tax farming company. So therefore, with this wall, they can, regulate the goods that come in and out of the city. And he's doing that obviously to raise money. And this will not look good in due course, and Lavoisier will end up guillotined. But it is, I think, I always love this story. I actually did a school project on Lavoisier.
Oh, no way.
So he's always been close to my heart because although he's undoubtedly part of this kind of exploitative framework, he is also, of course, a brilliant chemist. He's the guy who basically disproves that there's this kind of weird element, supposedly called phlogiston, that kind of results in explosions and things. And he says, no, it's all about oxygen and stuff. I'm slightly paraphrasing here. Chemists may be able to refine that take on it. But also, he is investing a lot of the money that he is making in charitable causes.
Right.
And among those is prison reform. He's very, very keen on improving conditions for prisoners. And the other, rather topically, bearing in mind that this is going out in the fortnight of the Olympics, he's very keen on purifying the water in the Seine.
Oh, right.
So it's a kind of weird nexus of the Ancien Regime, that it's exploitative, it's oppressive, it's enlightened, and it's compassionate, all in one kind of confusing hall of mirrors.
Well,
Dominic, his hall of mirrors.
History's complicated, Tom. People are complicated, aren't they? Yeah,
it's complicated.
So his wall is an amazing thing. It's 18 miles in circumference and 10 feet high. It's a really, if it was standing today, you'd go and see it, as it would be a tourist attraction. Anyway, it's not standing because the crowd demolished the wall, and they demolish 40 customs posts, which are at intervals around the wall, and they burn all the records from the customs posts. Now, burning the records, people are doing this in the countryside at the same time. They're breaking into castles and chateaux and things.
It's very like the peasants' revolt.
Exactly, burning the feudal records of their own kind, the evidence, as it were, of their own subordinate status. So this is what people are doing outside Paris, and they're doing this all night. Now, back inside the city, of course, there are a lot of people with a lot to lose. There are the propertied middle classes, basically the people who up till now have been directing the revolutionary process. And a lot of them are extremely worried about the fact that the army has vacated the city and law and order is completely breaking down. And there's a group of royal officials that huddle around a guy who's effectively the mayor. He's called the Provost of Merchants, the Prévôt de Marchands. His name is Jacques de Flesselles, and we will come back to him at the end of this episode. Spoiler alert: he does not come to a very happy end. And the mayor basically says, "Listen, we need to rally the forces of order, and we will do this at dawn on the 13th of July. We'll sound the tocsin. The churches, the bells will toll an emergency signal. sort of a slow toll of the bell. We'll fire cannons. There will be drums, and these will call out representatives from the electoral districts to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, and we will meet and we will decide what to do.
And presumably this will have a very calming effect.
This is what they're hoping, madness. Because as soon as the tocsin starts tolling at dawn,
bells and cannon,
people are like, what's going on? And everyone pours out into the streets thinking the city's under attack from the army or who knows what. Now, at the Hôtel de Ville, the representatives of the electoral districts arrive and they agree to form a commune, a sort of an informal city administration to run their own affairs. The commune will become one of the great power bases in the French Revolution, although nobody, of course, knows this at the time. And they also say there are now mobs roaming the streets. There are also bands of vigilantes roaming the streets. We should regularize all this with a militia. They call it, entertainingly, the Garde Bourgeoise, the bourgeois guard. And this is what becomes ultimately the National Guard, again a key player in the revolutionary story. And they've been wearing, of course, Camille Desmoulins green sprigs, exactly. And they say, well, this green business is rubbish, not least because green is the symbol of one of the great reactionaries, the king's brother, the Comte d'Artois. And they said, we can't be wearing his colour. Why don't we wear the colours of Paris, red and blue? So that morning they swapped their cockades for red and blue cockades. We'll discuss the symbolism of cockades a little bit later. So meanwhile, the anarchy on the streets is actually getting worse. That morning, rioters sacked the convent of Saint-Lazare. They took loads of...
Which is where Beaumarchais had been.
Right, exactly. A nice bit nod back to your thing about the marriage of Figaro. Exactly. They find there a lot of food. Wine, vinegar, 25 Gruyere cheeses, which is exactly what I'd expect to be in a monastery, frankly, and a large dried ram's head. I mean, who knows what you'd be doing with that? Is that the basis for a soup? Who knows?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so monasteries and convents are always the setting for pornographic fantasy.
They are, exactly. About cheese.
Who knows what's going on there?
So anyway, they take all this stuff and they say, oh, well, this absolutely proves the privileged classes, the monks, the priests, the bigwigs have been hoarding food all this time, and that, of course, only inflames them more. And the drive to get weapons is now... They're desperate to get weapons because they think they're going to come under attack. They ransack a royal storehouse. They get loads of halberds. We had a few halberds in our British elections episode, so it's great to have halberds back on the show. Crossbows. They've got a cannon that was given by the King of Siam to Louis XIV, the silver-lined cannon. It was basically a toy cannon, life-size toy cannon. Anyway, they've got this cannon
decorated with elephants.
Yeah, almost certainly. This Thai cannon, bizarre. They go to the great sort of military hospital, Les Invalides. This is back when I say hospital, it's the place where soldiers.
So that's when Napoleon.
Yeah, when you wear red to retire. Have you? Oh, I've never been to the Les Invalides, Tom. I really should go and pay my respects to Napoleon. I think everyone
I stood next to his tomb and been filmed pondering.
Were you? Sort of in a Napoleonic manner? Yeah. Were you dreaming about invading Russia, leaving your troops behind as you'd left them behind after invading Egypt?
Cursing the British mastery of the sea.
Exactly, cursing the nation's shopkeepers. Well, but
obviously at this point it's not there.
No, the Invalides managed to sort of keep them away for the time being. Meanwhile, that guy, the mayor, Flessel, is sort of... He's playing what seems to be a very strange game. People are saying to him, where are the arms? And he's sending them off to different parts of the city where it seems like there's obviously not going to be any weapons. And people are starting to be suspicious. Is he playing a double game? Is he just trying to buy time? Is he wild goose chases? But all that day, the 13th, there is a sense of kind of increasing disorder. And then dawn breaks the following day, Tuesday, the 14th. And the bread price, not surprisingly given the chaos, has now reached its all-time peak. So it's now about 15 sous. And women who are going out to the markets to get bread are incredibly angry and saying, this is intolerable. We can't eat. We must take matters into our own hands. So that morning, the crowds are bigger than ever. About 80,000 people return to Les Invalides. They seize, they break in. It's scenes of tremendous chaos, kind of stampede. There's a crush. People are being crushed underfoot. They get muskets, about 5,000 muskets. They take out about 20 cannons, and they're passing them out among the crowd. But there is one thing they don't have. They don't have any gunpowder. They don't have anything to basically make the cannons work.
And so, Dominic, is there anywhere in Paris that might have a ready supply of gunpowder?
There is one place, Tom. And that place is the Bastille, the great fortress in the centre of Paris. And now the crowd turn their attention to the Bastille. So the Bastille, Tom, you will know, because you did a wonderful episode about the Man in the Iron Mask, that the Bastille is not quite what we think it was. So in our imagination, the Bastille is this towering Gothic castle. You know,
well, that's how it's shown in the paintings.
In the paintings, it's looming over the city. It's this terrible symbol of royal oppression, the embodiment of despotism and tyranny and whatnot. Now,
well, it's Gothic, isn't it, as well? Because this is the kind of the period of Gothic fiction.
Yes,
and it's a transplantation of a sinister baronial pile in the Alps or something right into the middle of Paris. But that's not actually
not
what it is.
It's got a bit of a Tower of London quality to it, I suppose. But it's quite squat. It has 8 round towers, and it does have walls that are 5 feet thick. But it had been built in the 100 Years' War as a defence against the English, I'm proud to say. And Charles the Mad, Charles VI, had converted it into a prison.
Well, we'll be looking at this in
the 100 Years' War
series we're going to be doing on the 5th in a few weeks' time.
Exactly. But it was Cardinal Richelieu in the 17th century who really said, let's use it as a prison for prisoners of state. And the people who were sent there, as you described in your episode you did on The Man in the Iron Mask, there's a thing called a lettre de cachet. And this is a kind of sealed letter approved by the king, in which your crime is often not nearly named. But basically, if there's a lettre de cachet, you can be sentenced without any process, without any trial. You can be basically thrown behind bars. So people are obviously up in arms. They see this as a symbol of arbitrary government and despotism and absolutism and whatnot.
But there are kind of three kinds, really, aren't there? So there's people who are seen as engaged in conspiracy against the monarchy.
Yes.
Of whom, whoever he is, the Man in the Iron Mask, would be the exemplary example. And there are writers whose works are seen to be seditious. So the most famous of these writers is Voltaire, the great kind of wit and philosophe who actually writes the story of the Man in the Iron Mask and basically kind of invents it as a symbol of royal tyranny. And then there are kind of basically people who are seen by their own families as troubled. And again, there is a famous archetype of this, a literary figure, who we've also done an episode on, and that is the Marquis de Sade.
That's right. So delinquents, whose own, aristocratic usually, whose own families basically petition the monarchy, please can you have my son locked up, he's totally out of control. I mean, that's what it is, isn't it? It's like sending your, if today you sent your child to, I don't know, to a sort of sanatorium or something, or to a clinic, to a
military school.
Yeah, exactly, that kind of thing.
And actually, it's quite a kind of mark of status, isn't it, if you're a writer or
to be sent to the Bastille,
a rebel, to be sent there, because that's what Beaumarchais finds so humiliating when he's sent to Saint-Lazare, that he isn't sent
a lesser prison. Yeah, and actually, the conditions in the Bastille, when I read up on it, it reminded me of the prisons that Dickens describes, like the Marshalsea or something. So it's all a bit Dickensian. Sharma compares it to an overgrown lodging house with guests living in different rooms according to their station. You can go into, if you remember the public, you can actually walk into the Bastille. You can go in and there are shops on the inside. There's a garden. The governor has a vegetable garden, so you can have a stroll and stuff. And inside, further inside, there's the kind of warren of rooms where the inmates are kept. And the conditions are actually not really that bad. So the extraordinary thing is, you are better off inside the Bastille than the vast majority of French people who live outside it. So,
well, the Marquis de Sade lives quite well. I mean, he's able to write.
Yeah. You have alcohol,
wine, and he sends his wife out to get him cheese.
That's right. He has 133 books when he's in there. And he has a desk, and he has dressing gowns, he has aftershave. He's allowed all these kind of treats. this is the norm. There are card games among there's a billiard table. There's a wonderful writer called Jean-François Marmontel. He was asked what was the food like in the Bastille, and he said, I always remember an excellent soup, a succulent side of beef, a thigh of boiled chicken oozing with grease, a little dish of fried marinated artichokes, really some fine crescent pears, a bottle of old Burgundy, the very best mocha coffee. So it's a kind of cross between, it's more like a hotel than a prison. And the demonology of it was invented by writers to criticize the regime.
Voltaire.
Yes. The most famous is a guy actually called Linguet, a barrister who was sent there, and we don't really know why, in 1780. And he published a book called Memoirs of the Bastille. And this is your classic kind of Gothic nightmare. You know, the clanking chains, the door crashing shut behind you. And he invented the idea, really, that the Bastille was this kind of living tomb, that everybody in it was the Walking Dead. They would never be heard
He must be
from
drawing
again.
on the Voltaire.
I suppose so, to some
Madame
extent.
Masque as well. I mean, it's kind of been laid. Those ideas are quite deep roots.
They do, and they're actually so successful, those ideas, that the government themselves have decided the Bastille has to go because it's basically bad. But even though it's fine, it's kind of bad publicity to have it. So by the 1780s, they have a plan to redevelop the Bastille. They're going to build a park instead with a column and fountains in the middle, and there'll be an inscription that says, ironically, Louis XVI, restorer of public freedom. Of course, that part that never happens.
I mean, the kind of the shades of irony that veil the Titanic episodes in the French Revolution are amazing.
So the Bastille has featured in people's imagination in the days leading up to the 14th of July, partly because of the Marquis de Sade. So he's in the Bastille. He's been following all the news from Versailles. He's really into it, isn't he? And he's been shouting political harangues from the window.
Yeah, because he takes a thing that he pees into, kind of metal,
a funnel,
funnel, and he uses that to shout out revolutionary slogans.
Exactly, and he says the governor is planning to. I'm in here with hundreds of inmates, and the governor is planning to kill us all. And this is a complete fantasy, and the governor.
So he gets bundled off to a lunatic asylum.
He's got to go. He's a real pain. Now, actually, we mentioned the governor. So the Marquis de Sade was kicked out 9 days ago, and the governor in those 9 days has been getting increasingly worried, as you might expect. His name is Bernard René de Launay, and he is 49 years old. He was born in the Bastille. His father had been killed as well. And basically, he's a very, very dutiful, humdrum, uncontroversial citizen, the guy who runs the Bastille. He's not a bad man, he's not a torturer, he's nothing like that. He's just kind of a boring official.
He doesn't cackle evenly.
He doesn't.
Fettering people in dripping gun.
Not at all. And he's been given this gunpowder to guard. The gunpowder has been sent to him, 250 barrels of it. And he's been told, don't let anyone have it. He has been sort of making vague preparations, like moving the cannons to the embrasures. He's told his men to gather some stones to throw at people if they try to get in, and bits of ironmongery and stuff. And I say his men. He has 82 old soldiers, like pensioners, invalides as they're called. And they are just loafers. They're completely useless. They're not going to really be at all use in a fight. And he's also been sent 32 Swiss guards. He has enough food to last him 2 days, and he has no water supply whatsoever. So when he sees this giant crowd advancing towards him, he thinks for God's sake, this is the last thing I need. Now, this crowd later ends up being sort of, dare I say, sacralized, Tom. There are 954 of them, and they are aged between 8 and 72, and they're known officially as the vainqueurs. You might say that all Frenchmen are vainqueurs one way or another, mightn't you? But anyway, that's a subject for a bonus episode. So most of these vainqueurs are artisans from the Saint-Antoine neighborhood, the neighborhood around the Bastille. And they are joiners and glaziers and cabinet makers and locksmiths. So because they ended up as these great heroes of the revolution, we know loads about them. Only one of them is a woman, a laundress called Marie Charpentier. Most of them, historians have really done tremendous work kind of analysing their background. Most of them had not been born in Paris. So that gives you a sense of just how transient the Parisian population is. How many migrants have come from the countryside for work or for bread and are now angry and resentful.
In a city like Paris, people are going to die of disease. And so the population cannot be maintained without this constant influx of people.
So they are angry, resentful, hungry. They're also frightened. There are lots of rumours that the army are preparing to retake the city. They're desperate to get this gunpowder. Anyway, so they've assembled, 1,000 of them or so, shouting and roaring outside the walls of the Bastille. More happily for Delaunay, 2 delegates arrive from the city hall, from the Hôtel de Ville, and they say, look, we've come to see you. And he says, well, funny enough, I'm about to have my breakfast.
Dinner.
It's 10 o'clock. So it's described as his déjeuner, but it's more of a brunch. He's about to have brunch. And he says, why don't you come in? So these guys go in and they have this enormous, I mean, obviously it's France, right? They have this enormous meal, which goes on for hours. And the crowd become very restless. What are they doing?
Well, if they're all starving to death outside.
And of course, we know what they're eating in the Bastille.
Having a croissant.
They're having an excellent soup, a succulent side of beef, a thigh of boiled chicken, oozing with grease. They're having all this.
Yeah.
Brilliant. The crowd get very restless. Another deputy arrives, called Thuriot de la Rosière, and he goes in to see Delaunay. By this time, he's got a very firm list of demands. He says, we want all your guns as cannons, as well as the gunpowder, and you must allow our new militia, the Bourgeois Guard, to take over the Bastille. And Delaunay says, look, I can't do that. I mean, I need instructions from Versailles. I've got my orders. You know, I'm just doing my job. I don't want any trouble. But you can't ask me stuff that I can't deliver. Thuriot says, I understand where you're coming from. I'm not happy about it, but I will go back to the Hôtel de Ville and report back and come and find out what's going to happen. So Thuriot goes back to the Hôtel de Ville, and there all these sort of electors and officials are huddled together, and they're chatting for about an hour about what are we going to do about the Bastille. And actually their attitude is, we don't want a massive fray in the centre of Paris.
Just to be clear, at this point, they're concerned with the Bastille as a source of ammunition rather than its role as a weapon.
Yes, absolutely, yes, they are. That is what they want. They want the gunpowder, they want the guns, but they're not talking about, the Bastille as the Gothic castle. I mean, if they can see the Bastille, they know what it is. But they've been talking about this for an hour. It's 1:30. Thuriot is going to be sent back to the Bastille with a loud hailer to kind of address the crowd and stuff, when suddenly they hear there's this enormous explosion, and the Hôtel de Ville literally shakes, and then they hear this further explosions, gunfire, and it's all coming from the direction of the Bastille. So what has happened? Well, while Thuriot and his friends have been meeting at the city hall, the crowd outside the Bastille have actually run out of patience and have just decided to take matters into their own hands. Some of them have started to burst into that outer courtyard with the vegetable garden and the shops, shouting, "Give us the Bastille, give us the Bastille." A load of them climb up to the top of a perfume shop, which is next to the gate that goes into the inner courtyard. And there's a drawbridge, which is closed. They cut the ropes holding the drawbridge up. Now, this is that classic kind of mad crowd behaviour. The drawbridge at this point falls open very unexpectedly and crushes people underneath the person dumping. The rest of the crowd, they dab about that and they just run over the drawbridge, presumably further flattening this poor man. There are soldiers up at the top who are shouting, stay away, we don't want to shoot you." The crowd think they are saying, come in, we won't shoot. So they charge in, and the Swiss guards start shooting at them. Now the crowd believe, quite wrongly, the people further behind say, oh, they must have lowered the drawbridge and let us into the inner courtyard as a trick, because they wanted to shoot us down like dogs. And they go ballistic. The crowd is now stampeding further into the Bastille, and the fighting kind of breaks out in earnest. And what then happens, of course, rumours spread. People, Chinese whispers. People are sort of saying, oh, the bombs are all kicking off at the Bastille. The guards are shooting at our people, at the crowd. There's a guy who's called Hulin, Pierre Augustin Hulin. And he runs out and he gets a load of gardes françaises, French guards, and he says, the criminal Delaunay is assassinating our fathers, our wives and our children. Will you let them be slaughtered? So these gardes françaises arrive, and they brought with them some cannons. And one of those, Tom, is that Siamese cannon. With the elephants, I think, are a figment of your imagination. But let's imagine it with the elephants, which was a present for Louis XIV, and they aimed these cannons at the gates. So it's total chaos inside the Bastille. Delaunay, the governor, is obviously very distressed at what's happened here. And
he's enjoyed a nice breakfast.
Yeah, well, it's true. He did get his brunch, but he is. Almost fair to say the last brunch. He just wants to basically the whole thing to be over with honour, and he wants an honourable surrender and no more bloodshed. He sends a note. He sends a note to the crowd. He says, "Look, I've got all these barrels of gunpowder. If you don't stop attacking, I will blow up the gunpowder before I'll blow up the whole thing, right, sky high." They don't want to give in to this ultimatum, and in fact, his own soldiers say, we don't, not a good idea. We don't want you to blow up all the gunpowder and us with it. And so eventually, Delaunay, this wheeze of his has failed, and he says, "Fine, let's call it a day." And he lowers the drawbridge that leads to the inner courtyards. The attackers now swarm over this drawbridge. Some of them are, even though he's basically surrendered and let them in, they're determined to have their sort of moment of glory anyway. So they climb the walls and they hack down the gate, which is a bit kind of unnecessary. And by about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the siege is over and there are white flags flying above the Bastille.
And they think they are going to find victims of royal despotism chained up in dungeons.
Of course they do. I mean, don't forget the Marquis de Sade has been telling them that this massacre was impending. And for years, as you said, going back to Voltaire, people have believed that the Bastille is rammed with the victims of despotism, with the free thinking.
How many did they find?
There are 7 people in the Bastille, 7 prisoners, 4 of whom are genuine criminals who are forgers, who cannot be romanticised at all. One of them is one of the...
But they go free, do they?
Yeah, the forgers do go free, I think. One of them is a sort of one of your posh libertines, a guy called the Comte de Solage, who'd been locked up at the request of his own family for bad behaviour. And 2 are lunatics. So, of the lunatics, as they're called, one of them is just obviously completely mad, and the other one is probably, some sources say English, some Irish, but I think it's generally agreed he's Irish.
He has a long white beard.
Yeah, people call him Major White. He looks good. He's the only possible candidate that they have where they can say they've rescued from this massacre, a symbol of liberation, because he's got...
He thinks he's Julius Caesar, doesn't he?
Yeah, they put him on their shoulders and carry him around the city. Hurrah, look at this man. Now, he thinks he's Julius Caesar, so he's very confused by the whole thing. He's kind of waving to the crowd. And I think the next day, they take him and lock him up in the lunatic asylum. So, actually, he was probably better off in the Bastille with his fine foods and his billiard table. Anyway, just on the Bastille itself, this is obviously very disappointing from the revolution's point of view. So they have to completely reinvent what happened and what they found. Revolutionary artists pour out prints and engravings that show torture chambers, Iron Maidens, men in iron masks, all of that kind of stuff.
And also the battlements being much, much larger.
Exactly. This extraordinary sort of Helm's Deep style siege, which is not really what it was. It was more like a sort of... It was more like a kind of... It was an element of the riot of football hooligans, I think, in the taking the Bastille. French citizens were shocked by this one. But the...
Do we have any?
No, so it's not an issue. They find some bits of old armour in the sort of cellar, and they bring that out and they say, torture equipment. They find a printing press, torture machine, all this kind of stuff. Bastille tourism in the next few days becomes a huge thing. So they basically, former wardens turn up. They give you a guided tour of the cells. Posh women will have themselves locked in overnight so they can enjoy the full Bastille. Yeah, toads and stuff.
The guy, there was a guy who made friends with his rats.
Is that?
So,
I didn't know that.
yeah.
So the rat romancy ad.
Yeah, well,
Who knew?
the rats became his big friend.
Okay. A really interesting story, and you can read up more about this in a lot of the French Revolution histories. Simon Sharma's really good at this, for example. There was a guy in the crowd who was a building contractor called Pierre-François Palloy, and he's very honest. He basically gets the contract to demolish the Bastille, but he makes tons of money from organising guided tours, lectures, all this kind of stuff. He builds France's first revolutionary altar from chains and manacles that claim to have found the Bastille. And then he becomes the great entrepreneur of Bastille merchandising. So he puts together a travelling revolution kit that his reps, his sales reps, take to every part of France, every one of the 83 departments. And it includes a big chest of souvenirs, literally inkwells that are supposedly made from fetters, paperweights in the shape of the Bastille, daggers, snuff boxes.
So Dominic, it's very like the way the Berlin Wall, chunks of the Berlin Wall are sold.
Enough chunks of the Berlin Wall to make millions of Berlin Walls, I think it's fair to say. It's exactly the same. Yeah. So, and it's a cross between medieval relics and basically modern souvenir tat. Mr. Palloy's souvenir kits. Anyway,
Which is the hinge between the past and the present.
that's history, Tom. What can you say?
It's history.
Anyway, that's the jump ahead. Let's go back to the afternoon of the 14th of July. So what happened to all the defenders? The Swiss guards were initially unharmed because they'd taken their uniforms off, so nobody knew who they were. Some of the Invalides are very, very harshly treated. There's a guy, a good example of this, there's a guy called Beccard. And this, I think, is a quite scary warning of what lies ahead. Beccard had been one of the key people in dissuading Delaunay from blowing up the gunpowder. And so actually, the crowd should have been quite grateful to him. But as soon as they get inside, he opens one of the gates and somebody cuts off his hand. The crowd believe that he must have been a jailer, so they wave his hand around and they put a key in.
Presumably still got
It's got the key in, yeah, sorry, it's got the key because he's opened the gate. So because of this, they parade around the city carrying this poor bloke's hand. Anyway, he manages to live to the end of the day, but then somebody again misidentifies him and says, oh, I think that bloke was one of the guys who was firing the cannons at the people, which he wasn't. So he ends up being hanged along with some of his comrades, which is very unfortunate, but not as thrilling as something that has always stayed in my mind ever since I first read it, which is 30, 40 years ago, which is what happened to the government. Remember I said he was just a functionary. He wanted to kill himself. He was so shamed by the dishonour of surrendering the fortress, but he was stopped from doing so by a grenadier. And the crowd sees on him, they drag him out, and they drag him towards the building. He's been dragged through the streets. People are spitting on him and kicking him and all sorts. A horrible scene. They get to the Hôtel de Ville, and then they say, well, let's kill him in a really amusing Baroque way. And there are some people who say, why don't we tie him to a horse's tail and drag him through the city and he will die by being dragged over the cobbles.
Because that's the kind of thing that royal executions do to awe and intimidate the masses. And so I suppose there's a kind of element of paying royal officials in their own kind.
Exactly. And there's a guy, a pastry cook, Desnaux, who says, no, we'll take him into the city hall, the Hôtel de Ville, and we'll give him a kind of a trial or something. And Delaunay, who at this point is battered, bruised, covered with blood, crying, whatever, he says, enough of this, I just, let me die. And he lashes out furiously, kicks the pastry cook, Desnaux, in the groin. And at that point, the crowd kind of close in on him, daggers drawn, bayonets, and people are in a frenzy, and they stab and stab and stab and then shoot his body as it lies in the gutter. And then somebody gives Desnaux the pastry cook a sword and says, you have the honour of cutting off his head. And Desnaux throws the sword aside and then the sword, he says, gets out a pocket knife, and he then kneels down and basically saws this governor's head off.
And so this story began with wax and
Yeah, and now and they put his head on a pike. The crowd are all laughing. There are women in the crowd, and that this is what shocks them. This is kind of cheering, singing, and they parade around. Now the mayor has been in the Hotel de Ville all this time, Jacques de Flessel.
This is the double crossing.
And people suspect of double crossing them. People seize him as well. They say afterwards they found a letter from Delaunay in his pocket saying, hold out, let's distract the rabble. Whether this is true, no, of course there's no evidence for it now. Flessel too was taken outside. He was basically ripped to pieces by the crowd, shot in the head, his head cut off, put on a pike, and then the crowd paraded on the streets with his two heads on pikes. So this is what's been happening in the city. That evening it starts to rain, and anyone who knows anything about riots and bombs knows that basically the single best way to end a riot is for it to start raining.
Like the Charters.
Exactly.
Got rain. There was no revolution.
Yeah. So the National Assembly, everything has died down in Paris, but the National Assembly moves to Versailles. That evening, as the rain is falling, a guy called the Vicomte de Noailles bursts into the National Assembly of Versailles, which is hours away from Ride or whatever, and says that all this chaos is going on in the city. And actually, the National Assembly are not jubilant. They are anxious, shocked. It is clear to them, to some of them even now, that this process that we thought they were controlling until a few days ago is spiralling well beyond their ability to restrain it. The king himself has been in the palace all day. That is why his journey writes to Brienne, nothing, because it's a hunting journey and he has not done any hunting, which in itself is a sign of how, it's changed for him.
So it's not him being obtuse.
No.
Failing to recognise his
No, there's an apocryphal exchange. Somebody comes in to tell him in the evening, another duke, and he tells them the Bastille is fallen. Louis is supposed to have said, "Is it a revolt?" And the guy said, "No, sire, it's a revolution." Again, that's too obvious. But the next day, 15th of July, all morning he dithers and he's not sure what to do. And eventually he goes into and decides he should go and address the National Assembly personally. He goes in with no guards, with no retinue, just with his two brothers, and he says, obviously things in this capital are totally out of control. I'm going to withdraw all troops. Please help me. He says, help me to assure the salvation of the state. Help me to send a delegation to Paris to sort things out. And the deputies are really impressed by this. They're moved by it. They start cheering, and they are brilliant. The king has shown his willingness to work with us, to recognise, our importance. And he's clearly going to play decently. So at 2:00 that afternoon, they send this great cortege, this procession of deputies and carriages to Paris. And they are led by the president and the vice president of the National Assembly. The president is an astronomer called Jean-Sylvain Bailly. And the vice president is a man that our American listeners will know, the Marquis de Lafayette.
A tremendous character.
Well, do you like the Marquis de Lafayette?
I do. I like him all.
Yeah, I've got no time for him at all. So he's a trustafarian. He's a rich aristocrat who went for his gap year.
He's gone off to fight in the American Revolution.
He's a tax cheat. He's a friend of tax cheats.
He hangs out with George Washington.
Yeah.
Basically becomes the son.
So he's still only 41. He's come back to France from America. He's a massive celebrity. He's been elected to the States General. He's a kind of liberal reformer, Lafayette, very much typical of his generation. I have to say, Tom, his biographers, and especially if they're not American, are not as keen on him as you are. So one biography calls him...
I wouldn't say I'm keen, I like his dash and his swag.
One biography calls him vain, naive, immature, and egocentric. And my favourite one
What's not to like?
is from the Histoire et Dictionnaire de la Révolution Française, which was compiled by French scholars in the 1980s for the bicentenary. And the entry of Lafayette describes him as an empty-headed political dwarf. So, brilliant. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying he's a political genius, but he has some swagger and that.
yeah, you love that.
And,
You love that. You love a political fool.
if he dresses well.
So they arrive at the Hotel de Ville. Huge cheers, all this kind of stuff. Bailly, the astronomer, people say, you be the mayor of Paris now. So he's going to be the mayor of Paris. And Lafayette accepts the command of this new militia, the Bourgeois Guard, the National Guard as it becomes. And it's Lafayette who says, why don't we, as a mark of compromise and the coming together of all these different forces, we will add to the red and blue colours of Paris the white of the Bourbon dynasty.
So, Dominic, I put it to you, is this the action of an empty-headed political dwarf?
Yeah, it's a terrible
Or a man with an eye for political symbolism that has endured to the present day?
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends what your views on the French flag, Tom. Do you like the old flag, the flag of tradition, honour, and the age-old customs
I have a lot of time
of a proud people? Or do you like a boring tricolour flag? I don't rate a tricolour flag personally. You know my methods. Anyway, so yeah, this is the origins of the French flag. The next day, the 16th, so only 2 days after the fall of the Bastille, the king holds his final ever royal council. His brothers and his relatives, a lot of them are basically now given up in the process. They say to him, you should leave, you should get to the frontier, get loyal troops, this is all out of control. But actually some people say, now we're not even sure we can get there in safety. Safety cannot be guaranteed. We just have to hope somehow, stick this out and hope we can turn this around. But Dominic doesn't. Look, tell me. Yeah, Marie Antoinette's friend.
Marie Antoinette's great friend.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. He's a rather good says good or bad.
Should have gone. Should have gone, Tom.
As events
will prove. So quite a lot of them do go that night. The Comte d'Artois, the Prince de Conti, the Prince de Condé. So these are the first émigrés. This is so the first time you have people fleeing France from frontiers, determined to there'll be no compromise with the revolution. But Louis himself does not flee. He instead, the following day, the 17th, makes an extraordinary gesture. He decides to go to Paris himself, in an undecorated carriage, wearing a plain, decorated coat. And he is greeted at the gates of Paris by the new mayor, Bailly, the astronomer from the and Bailly hands him the keys of the city. And he says, these are the same keys presented to Henri IV, great folk heroes of the French people, the king who had abandoned Protestantism because he said, France, what is it? Paris is worth a mass, is it? Paris is worth a mass,
yeah. Also, he's very keen that every person should have a chicken.
Exactly. Everybody loves him. Chickens and Catholicism. And Bailly says to Louis, these keys were given to Henry IV. He had conquered his people, but now his people have conquered their king. I mean, who wants to hear that? Poor Louis, smiling weakly. Anyway, Lafayette is there with his witty cockade colours, red, white, and blue. There are loads of National Guards now lining the streets. They process through the streets. Market women dressed in white make up the rear of the procession. More about market women, I imagine, in the next couple of days. And people are chanting, not long live the king, but long live the nation, the nation. They get to the city hall, and there's a great banner. Louis XVI, father of the French, the king of a free people.
And Dominic, key there is he's not described as the king of France.
No, but of the French.
So the idea that France is the property of the king is gone.
Exactly. Louis gets onto a throne and people make speeches. And he's said to have listened with tears running down his cheeks. Of course, some people say, wonderful, tears of patriotic pride. Others say, he's gutted. This is like the worst day of his life. Bailly gives him a tricolour cockade, red, white and blue, and the king sticks in his hat and everybody cheers. But what he is thinking, we don't know. We know he got back to Versailles that night about 10 o'clock. Marie Antoinette and his family were so worried about him. But what he said to them, what he made of it all, remains a mystery. Most people, though, at the time thought this was a truly exceptional event in history. One third estate deputy, Dr. Jean-Antoine Tiguet, said it was unique in the annals of the universe to see people that had taken up arms against their king, now reunited with their king in a world in which the balance of power had really changed. He says it was reserved for the French nation to give this example to the universe. And that universalism, we'll be talking about this tomorrow when you get onto the sort of ideological shift that the French Revolution represents. That universalism is so key to this whole story. There's a great source for this whole period, the letters of a bookseller called Nicolas Rouault, and he wrote to his brother after this. He said, everything will now change. Morals, opinions, laws, customs, usages, government. In very little time, we will be new men. And that, of course, is the French Revolution's appeal, the idea of starting anew and making a better world. But actually, Tom, it would be, to be Burkean, I think it would be wrong to end on the note of optimism, because actually the violence doesn't end with the fall of the Bastille. Something has been unleashed now, I would say, and I know this is just my own prejudice talking, but I would say something has been unleashed that cannot now be put back in its box. And the example of this is what we began with. So 7 days, 1 week after the fall of the Bastille, the food prices are still very high. And there are rumours that an official, the royal official of the War Ministry called Joseph Foulon de Douai, had said about the poor, let them eat straw. Whether he did say it, we do not know. A crowd grabbed him, they hanged him, they cut off his head, they stuck grass and straw in his mouth, and they paraded his head around the city on a pike. And then they saw his son-in-law, Intendant in Paris, the royal official responsible for Paris, who was Berthier de Sauvigny, the man you began with. And they grabbed him, they forced him, accompanied him around the streets. They held the head of Foulon in front of him, his father, and they chanted at him, kiss papa, kiss papa. I mean, an absolute unbelievably horrendous scene. They got to the city hall, they killed Berthier. They literally tore the heart out of his body and threw it in the windows of the city. And then they put his head on a pike too alongside his father as the parade was around. And that newspaper you mentioned, it was Revolution de Paris. He wrote a big article about this. That's what we're quoting. And Loustalot said, it's fine. They were both traitors to the nation, traitors to the people. And actually, it's only by killing such people that Frenchmen, you will be free. And as Simon Sharma says in his book Citizens, this isn't the end of something. This is just the beginning. When he's described these events, then Sharma writes, the violence was not just an unfortunate side effect of the French Revolution, it was the revolution's source of collective energy. It was violence that made the revolution revolutionary. And I'm afraid there will be a lot more violence to come.
But I think worth mentioning as well, there will also be a lot more idealism and abstract nouns to come. So we will see you.
Brilliant. Bye-bye.
So we've got the National Assembly, which is the conflation of what had previously been the three estates. There is now the National Assembly is the embodiment of the will and the sovereignty of the people. The Bastille has fallen. The first émigrés have fled, and Louis, who has not fled, is trying to reinvent himself as a constitutional monarch. But while all this is going on, everything that precipitated the revolution, so chiefly the fact that there's no money and that the bread price is very high, that hasn't really changed.
Yeah, so it's still an atmosphere of panic and crisis, isn't there? So here's the thing. Why are the deputies who are in the National Assembly, why would they spend all their time talking about declaration of human rights when you would think their priority would be to discussing bread supplies?
Because I think that most of the deputies who had assembled at Versailles in May 1789, so the Estates General, who then becomes the National Assembly, they thought that they could come to give France a new constitution. And I think they operate on the assumption that you can't remedy the ills facing France unless you reset the country on new foundations. And the Declaration of Rights is an attempt to frame for both the delegates themselves, but also for all the people of France, an understanding of what henceforward will be animating the new France.
Right.
And I think that is actually an understanding that is turbocharged by the Bastille. Because you were saying how the people in the National Assembly are actually perturbed by what happens.
Yeah.
They're unsettled by it.
And actually, I'm right in saying on side that as the weeks go by, so during the time they're thinking about this, the news coming in, not so much from Paris, but from the countryside, is more alarming than ever, and arguably more alarming than ever before in French history, because this is the year of what historians call the Great Fear, la Grande Peur, the
Yeah,
Great Fear.
Great Fear.
So this is coming in from the provinces.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's hope as well as fear. So we've already mentioned him, Arthur Young, this Englishman who gone on a trip across France.
An ill-timed holiday.
Yeah, an ill-timed trip. So he, 2 days before the fall of the Bastille, he is in Lorraine and he meets a peasant woman. He asks her, how you doing? And he writes what she said. It was said at present that something was to be done by some great folks for such poor ones, but she did not know who nor how. But God send us better than his property taxes and dues are crushing us. And Arthur Young has kind of illustration of the way that the poor are being crushed by the weight on them. He assumed that this woman must be 60 or 70. But he asked, it turns out to be 28. So, yeah.
Oh no, that's how French people look though, Tom. What can you do? But then the Bastille falls, and that actually that turns up. It doesn't lessen the tension in the countryside. It actually, the sense of being improved, because people now start. They hear that one fortress is fallen, and they start to attack other citadels in the domain. They're burning the registers and they're smashing their way into chateaux.
I think Fall of the Bastille is important as the fall of feudalism. And again, mentioned this in the previous episode, it's a very peasant revolt. There's this idea that if you as a peasant can burn the registers and the charters that condemn you to work as a peasant, then you will be free. And so they start targeting chateaux and particularly abbeys and monasteries, which also, as in the days of the peasant revolt, own large tracts of land, and this brings kind of feudal dues and tithes with them. So an example of an abbey that gets attacked is one in Burgundy called Senezon, and this is completely leveled, and it belongs to a very distinguished local family, the family of Talleyrand-Périgord. And the best known member of this family is actually the bishop of the town of and he had basically become a bishop because his nurse had been looking after him, drops him on the floor, damages his foot. He's about 3, and the foot never healed, and so he grows up unable to fulfil the military destiny that otherwise would have been his as a swaggering aristocrat. And so he has no choice but to go into the church, which is an absolute mismatch between his talents. He's quite Marquis de Sade. I mean, he's not that bad, but he's a kind of cynic. He's a free thinker. He's definitely inclined to libertinism, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
But he is unbelievably shrewd, kind of cunning operator. Kind of almost the embodiment of the Machiavelli, isn't he? He's
the great survivor.
The great survivor. So he gets elected as a member of the First Estate, so that's the church, to go to Versailles. And when he's there, rather than kind of back from the church, he teams up with Mirabeau, who's the great spokesman for the Third Estate, and they are sat together, kind of working out drafts of the Declaration of the Rights of Man as news from the provinces is coming in. And the news is very, very alarming if you have any commitment to the integrity of the nation. So the whole country seems to be disintegrated. And we talked about the importance of rumour and the anxiety of conspiracy in the context of the Bastille. This is exactly what's happening in the countryside as well. And there are kind of terrified stories that the aristocrats are deliberately setting out to starve or poison the poor. And if that sounds mad, again, this is a staple of plots in the Marquis de Sade's novels, this idea that aristocrats have nothing better to do than to kind of plot starvation and ruin for the entire country is clearly part of the kind of the climate of paranoia of the time.
And even at this stage, there's a sort of I don't know whether xenophobia is too strong a word, but there's a great fear of foreigners. That there are foreign armies that are poised to attack at any moment. That there are foreign-sponsored bands of brigands. People attack foreigners. They attack Jews. They're looking for scapegoats, and this sort of mad paranoia that there's somebody out there, maybe just over the hill, who's going to attack your town, burn your crops, steal all your food, all of that kind of stuff.
And so the process of people then forming militias to guard against this fear, this will then get reported by a neighbouring community, who will then see this militia as precisely what they've got to guard against. So it has a kind of knock-on effect that people are raising militias against the phantoms of militias, and so it goes on. And this is absolutely not what people want. People are not demanding kind of the disintegration of the country. Actually, they want greater control. They want people who can sort this out, give them bread, give them security. And back in Versailles, the delegates are themselves stressed that they're unable to fight this, and they get caught up in the mood of panic themselves. And so the more radical among the deputies think, we need to do something dramatic here that will reassure people that we're on their side. So one of them calls it a kind of magic, and this kind of magic happens on the evening of the 4th of August, 1789, and it's a time when the National Assembly is actually very thinly attended. It's the evening, and the guy stands up who you mentioned, Dominic, in the previous episode, Vicomte de Noailles, the guy who comes in and reports the fall of the Bastille to the king. And he's a man who has a foot in both the kind of the royal and the revolutionary camps. So his mother is Madame Etiquette, who is the guide to Marie Antoinette, who is always kind of scolding her for breaking the etiquette and so on.
Yeah. So they uphold the embodiment of the rules and regulations of the court.
Exactly. But he has served alongside Lafayette, who is his brother-in-law, in the American Revolution. And when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, he had been the official representative of France.
I hate him already.
Right. Well, so he's interestingly positioned, and so he stands up and he says that the Kingdom of France is floating between the complete destruction of society and a government which would be admired and followed throughout Europe. So in other words, we have to do something radical or it will be complete anarchy. And so the radical step he proposes is that all the feudal obligations should be abolished, which of course is essentially means that from that point on people will not need to go around ransacking chateaus and abbeys.
Yeah.
And the other thing, which he proposes in a very kind of offhand manner, is that everyone in the kingdom should pay taxes. And this is precisely the issue that had been inspiring people in the previous year to refuse to accept the king's kind of fiscal solution.
This is the maddest aspect of this whole story, the sense of people talk about one journalist describes it as a moment of patriotic drunkenness, people throwing their distinctions on the and saying, let's all pay tax. And the madness is this whole situation has come about.
Yeah, they've just done that.
They just agreed to pay taxes as the king wanted a year or two earlier. I mean, it is the extent to which they have swung, and they're now seized with this almost hysterical, almost paranoid. I mean, it really is
well, so Sharma calls it a cult of self-dispossession, and I think it is something that would be very recognisable today. It's people checking their privilege. Yeah, standing up and saying, "I have too much privilege. I must get rid of it all." But there's also a kind of tit-for-tat quality between the representatives of the church and aristocracy. So Bishop stand up and proposes the abolition of all hunting rights. So essentially, from this point on, anyone can just go and shoot anyone they want. So Duke then stand up and says, "Yeah, fine, but we'll get rid of church tithes." And by the end of it, I think it's not just feudalism that's being jettisoned, but the very notion of privilege itself. And so William Doyle in the Oxford History of the French Revolution, he says it proved to be the most sweeping and radical legislative session of the whole French Revolution. And it was all just the event of a night. People standing up and saying, let's get rid of everything.
All that fuss about states like privilege being party liberty.
Yeah.
And now in 1 evening, they're
all
thrown
gone.
all away. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then, of course, 3 weeks later comes the Declaration, which is the second kind of monumental moment in this process of legislation. And you said last time that actually the guy who originally proposes it is your mate Lafayette,
An empty-headed political dwarf, as the dictionary of the French Revolution calls him.
a dashing representative of Franco-American friendship. And obviously he's been in America. He's very close to George Washington, has close relations with Thomas Jefferson, who is the American ambassador in Paris at this point. And so he basically proposes typically on the American model. And he thinks, just as the American Declaration has joined the various states in America together, he thinks that it will help unify a sundering nation in France. And it proclaims 17 rights. And the first of these, men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on considerations of common good. So that is equality. That's the expression of all the feudal privileges that have been jettisoned. And this in turn then defines what the purpose of good governance should be. The aim of every political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression. With an emphasis there, I think, on the first one, liberté. So that's the second article. And I think it's very obvious what the target of that article is. And the third article makes it clear. The principle of any sovereignty lies primarily in the nation. No corporate body, no individual may exercise any authority that does not expressly emanate from it. So the corporate body is clearly the church, and the individual is clearly the king. Neither actually mentioned.
And no supernatural right.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the nation, so a New Hampshire now, no one questions what the nation would be or says, well, actually, that's not fine. What it belongs to the nation? The nation.
Well, the nation is community joined in the bonds of fraternity.
Yeah.
So we have equality, liberté, fraternity. They've all been kind of name checked. And then, so that's the kind of the more abstract end of the list. But what you then have is a whole list of articles that are clearly very, very prescriptively trying to knock away the various props of the Ancien Régime. So Article 9, every man is presumed innocent until he's been declared guilty. That's targeting the lettre de cachet, the way in which the king could just have people arrested and put in prison. Article 10, no one may be disturbed on account of his opinions, even religious ones, as long as the manifestation of such opinions does not interfere with the established law and order. So that's targeting the privileged position held by the Catholic Church. This is in law. So ever since 1715, Protestants have been named illegal. Catholicism has been the only legally permissible faith. And so it's unsurprising that actually even the clerics who cheerfully jettison their privilege very, very upset about this. And it's their opposition that delays the final agreement on this document for about a week.
Okay.
And then Article 11, the free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. So no more censorship, whether that's coming from the king or from the church.
So Tom, the question is, I mean, some of these things, as an Anglo-Saxon, you could say, we have quite a lot of this in Britain or in the new United States of America. So to what extent do you think this is genuinely, I mean, I can see how if you're a Frenchman, you think this is groundbreaking and a transformative moment in world history. But of course, I mean, there's sort of, to go back to the Margaret Thatcher argument, could you say, well, come on, a lot of this exists already, what's so special and what's so groundbreaking about all this?
So I think it is an absolutely decisive moment in world history. And it's decisive because it is an overt rupture with so much that had gone before, and it's a rupture that's happening in the preeminent intellectual capital of Europe. But I think it's also significant as a reiteration of things that had gone before. So I don't think that the rupture is quite as complete as people say. So it's very subconsciously a new beginning. That's what this is the great kind of manifesting principle that governs the whole declaration. But of course, as you pointed out, the revolutionaries are the first to attempt such a thing. And it's kind of implicit in the Declaration, because it's saying that the rights of the claims are unnatural, unalienable, and sacred. Then it's mad to think that they can't have been proclaimed before. Or are the French saying, they're the first people to discover them?
To have noticed it, yeah.
And then there's the further issue of, is this a document that is targeted at France at a particular moment in its history, or are the pretensions it has to be universal? Are they authentic?
Well, that's La Nation. If you're talking about the nation, that raises that as a problem. This is an argument that goes to the core of the French Revolution. Is it universal, or is it? Well, it obviously is universal, but it is also universal nationalism.
It is,
and it's France that invents modern nationalism.
Yeah, and so there's a massive tension there, which I think will run throughout the revolution, and indeed throughout 19th and 20th century history as well. But what it does very effectively is to provide a kind of legal imprimatur for the destruction of the Ancien Regime. So it's the intellectual parallel to the demolition of the stones of the Bastille. So just as the walls of the Bastille are being demolished, the appearance of these words and articles on a piece of paper that then gets passed is doing something similar. It is eradicating, supposedly, the taint of absolutism. So this idea that sovereignty now lies with the nation and not the king, this is a massive, massive step. And the implications for what had previously been the two states, the nobility and the church, are obviously also sizable. So the logical implication is that the nobility should no longer exist. If they have no privileges, then what's the point? And basically within less than a year, so on the 19th of June 1790, all hereditary titles are abolished, and all the kind of traditional symbols of nobility, so coats of arms, kind of the liveries that are worn by servants, people with very little use in church, all that kind of thing, they all go. But it's the church that actually loses even more, because that most of the aristocracy have so much land. Of course, property has been guaranteed under the Declaration of the Rights of Man, so they keep their lands. For the church, it's a much more crippling fact that tithes have been abolished, the money that is raised to keep the church going, that's gone. So when that happens, particularly the poor parish clergy have completely lost their source of income. And the Catholic Church has also been forced to concede complete and total freedom of worship and thought. And I think that in a way this is the most, in the context of France, this is the most revolutionary development of all. Because the church in France is an even older institution. Its privileges have been very, very large over the course of French history. Going back to the very founding of the monarchy. So I think two scenes from the reign of Louis XVI kind of illustrate the way in which even the monarchy stands in the shadow of the antiquity of the church. So Louis' coronation, June 1775, massively retro, even though actually Louis does make sure that Marie Antoinette has her own purpose-built toilet, which is very nice.
Yeah.
So it's held in Reims, where this is the traditional place for kings to be crowned. This is the key episode in the life of Joan of Arc, where she gets to crown the Dauphin there. But the reason why Reims is the place that you go is that in 496, the first Frankish king to convert to Christianity had been crowned there, and he had supposedly been anointed with oil from a kind of a flask, a casket that had been brought down by a white dove. And Louis, standing there being crowned, had I swear to devote myself sincerely and with all my power to annihilating heretics condemned by the church in all lands under my rule. there you have everything that the Enlightened despise. The French church, cutting doves coming down with oil, and sectarian hostility to Protestants.
Louis is undoubtedly taken enormously seriously, and as we'll see, the fact that he is now contravening that oath and what he sees as his loyalty to the church more generally, that is going to have a massive psychological impact on him.
It will. And then Dominic, bookending that, at the beginning of his reign, the episode that you described in the previous episode where he comes to Paris after the fall of the Bastille, and he goes to the Hotel de Ville, and he is given the cockade, and the cockade by Lafayette, and this will form the colours of the tricolour. So white for the colour of the monarchy, and blue and red for the city of Paris. And why red and blue?
That's a good question.
These are the colours of the two saints, the two of the patron saints of Paris. So the blue is for Saint Martin, Saint Martin of Tours, a man of very humble stock who in the 4th century had risen to become the Bishop of Tours, and he is famous, of course, for giving half his cloak to a beggar who had no clothes, who you might describe as a sans-culotte, a man too poor to buy his own clothes. And Saint Martin gives him a cloak to cover him. And the red is for Saint Denis. And Saint Denis had supposedly been beheaded in the 3rd century on a great hill overlooking Paris that had then been given the name of Montmartre, the mountain of the martyr. And from Montmartre, Saint Denis was supposed to carry his head, preaching a sermon as he went. He then reaches the spot in the north of Paris where he finally dies, and the great basilica dedicated to Saint Denis is raised over him. And this is the French Westminster Abbey. This is where all the kings and queens of France are buried. And it kind of beautifully exemplifies the historical ironies and tensions of the fact that this cockade that Louis is wearing in his hat is a symbol of a new order. It's the union of a patriot king, a constitutional king, with his people, but it also, without most people even thinking about it, has these echoes of a fabulously ancient past. And it focuses, I think, the big question: is it possible actually to have a new beginning that doesn't bear these trace elements of the past?
Right. Can you have year zero?
Can you authentically have a year zero, or are you inevitably, in doing that, going to bear the kind of marks of the contamination of the past, reaching back, not just decades, but centuries and even millennia? And you can ask the same question about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Is it a repudiation of the Catholic heritage, the Christian heritage, or Dominic? Is it something more complex? Is it?
So when people ask, is it a bit more complex? They never say that. Have you noticed that? They never do that. I've never.
Because it never is it? It never is.
Episodes. So Jonathan Israel argues that there were different. The Enlightenment is this process it's driven by human reason and scientific inquiry and all of that kind of thing, the skepticism, and that it has different phases. And there's something that he calls the radical Enlightenment. And what exactly how does he distinguish the radical Enlightenment?
So the radical Enlightenment is overtly hostile to religion, often overtly hostile to monarchy. So, and because the French Revolution will end up bringing down both, it's understandable why people should look to the kind of the underground writings of the Enlightenment for inspiration. And there are indisputably figures who do bear the markers of that, and probably the most famous of them is an aristocrat, inevitably, called the Marquis de Condorcet, who is a philosopher, he's a mathematician, he's an economist, and he, a bit like Lavoisier, he's a great enthusiast for human articles. So he's kind of Fergal Sharkey-esque quality to our emphasis. So Fergal Sharkey was a campaigner against pollution of Britain's rivers, and in tremendously well. And his hostility to sewage and rivers is reflective of his hostility to the sewage of superstition and barbarism in public discourse, Dominic.
No one likes the sewage of barbarism, do they?
No. Well, I don't know. I've got a slight soft spot for it, I'll be honest. And so, unsurprisingly, when the revolution kicks off, the Marquis de Condorcet is a huge enthusiast for it. And he casts it absolutely, as it so often is to this day, as being the triumph of progress over superstition. And he's very, very into the idea that what you have to do is dig down deep, muster empirical data, don't rely on kind of mad stories about doves bringing down holy oil or anything like that. That's not going to help in the battle with ignorance and poverty. Christianity is nonsense. It's objective reason that will provide the inspiration for people in the war against all the faults that the Ancien Regime have embodied. And he sees the duty of the revolution to scour France and, more broadly, the world free of the taint of specifically Christianity. So he says the Christian millennium is an impressive demonstration of what energetic reaction can do to spread superstition, demote prolong stagnation, secure tyranny, degrade man as a reasonable being, and thus hold back the march of mind for centuries. And in saying that, he is echoing the kind of underground enlightenment philosophers, but he is also echoing the most famous of all the French philosophers of the 18th century, Voltaire, the great wit who cast the Bastille as this terrible dungeon about the man in the iron mask, and is very, very, probably the most famous writer in 18th century Europe. He's dead by the time the revolution breaks out, but is a massive influence on the way that Europe, and France particularly, has come to see the past. And Voltaire's great clarion cry is "Écrasez l'infâme," destroy the infamous thing, the thing of infamy, by which he doesn't just mean the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church is a particular object of his hate. He basically means Christianity. And so he says like this: every sensible man, every honourable man must hold the Christian sect in horror. And he is a brilliant writer, but he's also a brilliant activist. And again and again, he fixes on examples of tyranny and oppression that he knows will resonate with the French people. So his story about the man in the iron mask is one of those, but there's an even more vivid example because it happens in his own lifetime. So he's picking up on a live injustice. And this happened in 1762, and it was a Protestant, a Huguenot from Toulouse in the south of France called Jean Calin, who had been accused of murdering his own son, and he had been convicted under very dubious circumstances.
Yeah, he obviously didn't kill him.
Yeah, obviously. Well, so it turns out.
Yeah.
And he's broken very horribly on the wheel. And Voltaire picks up on this, and he says this wasn't, he was broken on the wheel not because people really thought that he killed his son, but because he was a Protestant. It's an example of, religious intolerance at its brutal worst. He casts Calin as a victim of sectarian persecution, and his campaign has such an impact that in 1764, so only 2 years after he had died, Louis XV, the predecessor of Louis XVI, had actually received Calin's family at Versailles, and the following year had issued a posthumous exoneration. This is typical of Voltaire's campaigning, and it makes him someone that people, not just in the kind of radical wing of French opinion, but across the whole span of French society, admire very much. So, in 1778, Talleyrand, Bishop Autun, had actually gone and visited Voltaire. So Voltaire had been allowed to come, he'd been in exile in Geneva, he'd come to Paris, and Talleyrand had gone to visit Voltaire there, and Voltaire by this point is incredibly old, and he has this brilliant description of Voltaire. Every line of that remarkable countenance is engraved in my memory. I see it now before me, the small fiery eyes staring from shrunken sockets, not unlike those of a chameleon.
Yeah.
It's widely held by enthusiasts for the revolution that the revolution is that he is the father of it. The Glorious Revolution has been the fruit of his works, one of them says. And in fact, in 1791, so 2 years after the fall of the Bastille, Voltaire's remains are dug up and reinterred in what is an almost completed church, but has been reconsecrated as a temple to liberty, the Pantheon, the Pantheon, the temple to all the gods. And Voltaire is buried there in its kind of great splendour as one of the kind of the presiding inspirations of the revolution.
But obviously, so you can see why all this stuff, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the legacy of Voltaire, you can see why all this relates to the market. So somebody who sees themselves as a right free thinker, genuinely kind of metropolitan intellectual. But obviously, most of France is not populated. It's a very rural area where vast millions upon millions of people work around. They're used to the old ways, the old parish church, the local curé, the rituals of the Catholic care, all of that kind of stuff. And they are not really built up. So what on earth did they make of this move from August 17 onwards, the kind of anti-Christian side of the revolution?
I think lots of them come to be infused by the spirit of the revolution. I think they come to accept the revolution on its own terms, but equally lots of them are appalled. And the more devout among Catholics come to see the whole revolution basically as a massive Protestant plot. And one of the reasons for that is that Protestants are actually, they have quite leading roles in the revolution. So they're, the moment that they're allowed to practice their religion freely, they're busy building churches. They're often quite wealthy, so they have the money in hand. They're busy joining revolutionary committees in Paris, across the whole of France. And in March 1790, the Protestant pastor is actually elected president of the National Assembly. So Catholics who feel upset about what has happened, they look at this and they, you can find evidence for thinking, well, it's Protestants who are behind it. And I think what gives that, what kind of really puts rocket fuel in that fear is the fact that there are clearly two massive echoes of the Reformation that Catholics find quite hard to miss. So the attack on the Catholic Church again and again is cast as an attack on superstition.
Very Thomas Cromwell.
So the attacks on privilege are often very stridently anti-clerical. And just as in the Reformation, so now the end of censorship means that pamphlets and illustrations can flood everywhere. And you don't even need to be able to read to understand kind of anti-clerical, anti-religious pamphlets. It's immediately apparent. And anyone with any familiarity with the Reformation will, of course, immediately see the parallels. And just as Luther kind of staged mocking ceremonies that symbolically cast contempt on the papacy, the same thing is happening in the Revolution. The Church and the aristocracy are both objects of kind of staged managed processions that make them out to be kind of completely ridiculous. You get parodies of the Mass, you get plays that are very anti-clerical get put on in the Paris theatres, sponsored by enthusiasts for the Revolution. And undoubtedly, lots of people are swayed by this. They find it very exciting, the way in which suddenly they're being allowed to think in ways that they previously had never thought to think. But there are others who find it deeply unsettling. So that's on the ideological level. But of course, the Reformation isn't just about ideology. It's also about hard cash and property. And there is an attack that kind of builds up from the abolition of the church's tithes through the months and years that follow, that is actually pretty Henry VIII. Because we've said that the revolution hasn't really improved the fiscal crisis that had done so much to bring it about. France is still basically bankrupt. There's no money. So how to plug the gap? And that's exactly the question that prompted Henry VIII to end up dissolving the monasteries. And it's the solution that the more radical elements in the National Assembly kind of start. Maybe we can do this because the church owes something
so much.
Yeah, I mean they own something like 10% of the nation's wealth. Who's the guy who basically proposes this?
Talleyrand.
Talleyrand.
The bishop have done. But I mean, that bishopric is kind of slightly novel.
Slightly. So he does this on the 10th of October. So that's a few months after the abolition of the tithes. And I think, actually, to be fair to Cameron, it's not just a kind of cynical proposal. Because he's saying we can take these lands and it could, lots of money could go towards helping the nation's finances, but we could also basically nationalise the church. And we could use the money from all of these properties to give all the people in the church a kind of flat fee, a flat income. And this is Joseph II, the emperor, the Habsburg emperor, the brother of Mary Antoinette, come up with a very similar plan. And that basically has gone through. So there are elements of the church you think, yeah, fine, fair enough. And obviously the radical elements, like Mirabeau and his pals, they think it's a brilliant idea. And they take it to the National Assembly. The vast majority of people in the National Assembly aren't clergy, so they think it's brilliant as well. And the proposal is voted through. But it has to be said that for obvious reasons, most of the clergy really, really hate it. Because the implication is that they will now be kind of moral functionaries, state employees. And this isn't the sense they have of their education at all.
And isn't this interesting that when we were talking about the Estates General, which becomes the National Assembly, we were saying that some of the big drivers of reform are the parish priests, who are the poorest people there, who are the closest to ordinary Frenchmen, who are often seized with a real idealism.
Because they're the first to join the Estates General, aren't they? It's a few poor parish priests.
Yeah, to go and join the Third Estate and become the National Assembly. But within months, a wedge is being driven between the revolution and probably the majority of the priests. Even those who end up signing up to it are very, very conflicted about it.
I think there are the poorest priests are the ones likely to side with this because they stand to benefit. But obviously, any priest with a relatively higher income is going to have to take a pay cut. And the people who are really in the hospitals are the monks and the nuns, just as they were in the Gates Reformation. Because first they've been deprived of their income and now they're deprived of their lands. And the corollary of this is exactly as in the Gates time. From the 13th century, all monasteries and convents, except those who are devoted to charitable work, are officially dissolved, and it's forbidden people to start taking monastic vows or vows, conventional vows.
And how much is there in France the same prejudice, the same preconception that monks and nuns are incredibly fat and corrupt and sexually depraved? Yeah, that classic kind of Protestant image.
I think much greater. Because I don't think that was the case in Reformation England, but it's definitely the case in 18th century France. That monks and nuns have been absolute staples of these kind of pornographic tracts that we've been talking about quite a lot. Not because we're prurient, because they condition how people see the establishment in quite a fundamental way. And there is a feeling among enthusiasts for the Enlightenment that there is they are useless. Yeah. They contribute nothing to society. They need to be turned into useful citizens. And so, March and April 1790, you get all these kind of bands of patriots, their brigades and their revolutionary sashes, turning and going full Thomas Cromwell, kind of chucking the monks and the nuns out. So you can see why, by the summer of 1790, I think that there is a kind of increasing sense of alienation in the church from the revolution. This is not what the Abbé de Sieyes thought that he was encouraging when he first proposed dissolving the National Assembly.
Yeah.
In Talleyrand's own siege of Autun, you start getting letters from his flock, kind of saying he's an absolute traitor, he's a Judas. What is he up to? But it's not just in Italy, it's across the whole of France. You get priests who, they don't want to withhold their sense of themselves as belonging to God's church and to just become the equivalent of kind of magistrates or officers in the army. The whole point of being a priest is that their primary loyalty is not to the patron, not to the Lord. It is to God.
You have that tension with the universal nationalism. yet again.
But talking of universalism, I mean, Catholicos means universal, and the head of the universal church is the Pope. So that is the head of the church, not the National Assembly. And the Pope is saying, basically, I'm going to put up with this kind of revolutionary stuff. So he, in secret, the Pope in Rome, Pius VI, he starts to condemn the Declaration of the Rights of Man and all the policies that they pursue in France on kind of relations with the church. And this obviously sets up a kind of massive tension within the church and by extension within the vast mass of the French people. Not least because the National Assembly, rather than trying to arrive at a recommendation with the papacy and the church, just doubles down. They're not going to use to negotiate superstition and absolutism. They're not going to allow the privilege to flourish. And so they feel we need to find a supply of committed citizen priests. The church as it stands is not doing that, so we need to push things forward. And their solution in July 1790 is to draw up what they call the civil constitution of the clergy. And by the tenets of this, priests and bishops are to be elected. And of course the electorate by this point would include Protestants, it would include Jews, it would include self-professed atheists, and they will effectively, it's like electing a JP or something. And once they have been elected, everyone who is going to take up his position, as a kind of state priest, citizen priest, will be obliged to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation and to its laws. And I think that to most people in the National Assembly, this doesn't seem a big deal at all. It's a kind of, it's a process of legislative tidying up. But to priests, to lots of priests, it's a source of complete agony because they have now been put in a position, lots of them have been struggling to avoid, where they have to choose between swearing this oath, the oath to the revolution, or staying true to the authority of the Pope, of the Church, of God.
It's massive moments, isn't it?
It's a really, really invidious choice. And, just as the Declaration of the Rights of Man tends not to have perhaps the resonance in English-speaking countries that it certainly does in France, so likewise, this civil constitution of the clergy, I think you said, what's the key moment in the French Revolution? I certainly wouldn't have said this, but it's amazing when you read histories of the revolution, English histories of the revolution, again and again, historians point to this as being the key moment that fractures the revolution, fractured any sense of kind of national harmony. So this is Simon Sharman. The civil constitution was not simply another piece of institutional legislation. It was the beginning of a holy war. William Doyle in the Oxford History of the French Revolution. The French Revolution had many turning points, but the oath of the clergy was unquestionably one of them, if not the greatest. And Peter McPhee, in his brilliant Liberty or Death book on the French Revolution, the oath fractured both the church and the revolution.
Yeah, I remember doing this A-level exam with the civil constitution of the clergy. I regarded it as incredibly boring and dry, and everybody kind of skipped it because we couldn't wait to get onto the terror. But I think you're quite right to emphasise it, because this does feel like the moment when what has been kind of one process carrying a lot of people along with it, when it really divides and it becomes, that tension has always been there, and that sense of an incipient kind of division between us and them, between the people who are on the side of the patrie or the nation and those people who are traitors, conspirators. But this is the moment that drives a lot of people who might otherwise have gone along with the revolution against it, because they are asked to rip up everything they held, not just dear, but everything they held sacred. And a lot of people just will not do that. And I think there are the faintest echoes of the Brexit referendum for us in Britain. Right.
Because effectively, it comes to serve as a referendum, because priests pay attention to what their flock think. And the division is quite kind of Brexit-like. So 54% of priests end up taking the oath, which means that 46 don't. And there are very clear geographical divisions. So in Paris, the oath taking is very high in the regions around Paris. Provence is very high, but in the countryside, particularly in the west, it's essentially you have what is now emerged as a counter-revolutionary bloc, and you have people who are defining themselves as citizens, and you have people who are defining themselves as Christians, as communities of souls.
Yeah.
And both sides come to increasingly cast the other side in the darkest possible light. So enthusiasts for revolution see their opponents as people who are clinging on to superstition and all kinds of privilege and all kinds of things like that. Whereas enthusiasts for increasing change see revolutionaries as bloodthirsty fanatics who are destroying everything that has made their life precious. And it's the moment when people turn to revolution as the opposite of revolution, which up until that point I think you hadn't had. And it poses the question of could it have might the revolution have been able to take the vast mass of Catholic citizens with them. And there's a kind of, I know of no better kind of teaser for that question than a famous painting which was done in 1789 in the wake of the drawing of the Declaration of the Rights of Man by a painter called Jean-Jacques François Le Barbier, who had actually been a court painter to Louis XVI. And in the wake of the signing of the Declaration, he is employed to give it a visual representation. So he gives all the kind of the favourite symbols. So there's, broken chains, and there's a liberty cap, and there's a great Masonic eye gazing down. But the thing that's striking about the portrayal of the Declaration itself is that it is written as though it is carved onto stone tablets.
Yeah.
And the stone tablets, of course, are an echo of the tablets that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai, which is the kind of the definitive expression of divine revelation, not of human law.
And of course, a prefiguring, Tom, an important and interesting prefiguring of Ed Miliband's stone tablets, 2015.
Yeah, so the echoes of the French Revolution reverberate everywhere. When Le Barbier is doing that, what is he doing? Is he saying it's possible to synthesize the Bible and the Enlightenment? You don't need to choose between the two can merge. And if that's what he's saying, I mean, it's not completely mad, because actually it's very clear when you look at the Enlightenment that a lot of the values that the Enlightenment assumes are universal, that everyone would accept, are actually bred from deep Christian assumptions. And people who listen to this podcast regularly will be aware.
Have I ever heard you use that phrase before? You should have a Tom Holland generator. Just press a button and it says bred of deep Christian assumptions.
But just to give an example, so Voltaire, his horror of the fate of Jean Calas, why is he so upset by this? Why is he upset by the torture to death of an innocent man on an instrument of torture? It clearly reflects kind of deep psychological response to the figure of Christ that Voltaire would have absorbed as a child, I think.
Maybe, or maybe he just doesn't like people being broken on the wheel by torture. I mean, is that not possible?
But there you're assuming that that's something instinctively that people would react against. I mean, I think the evidence suggests contrary-wise. I think people have plenty of societies have been perfectly happy with that. And Calas himself on the wheel, actually, that kind of makes this parallel explicit. I die innocent, I do not pity myself. Jesus Christ, who is innocent, died for me by even more cruel torments. And I think what kind of brings this home is the fact that Calas is exonerated by the French king, the anointed king, Louis XV. And he's exonerated not because Louis XV has become an enlightened philosopher, and not because the vast mass of people in France have got sympathy with Calas have become enlightened philosophers and sympathy with Voltaire's scepticism, but because they see Voltaire's campaign as being entirely according to Christian principles. So just to quote Benjamin Now, who wrote a brilliant book out there, the view that the impact of the Enlightenment polarised French thought, creating two large, mutually suspicious groups, one clerical and the other anti-clerical, is to read back the developments of the revolution, where it does happen, into a period when they simply were not present. And, we talked about the role that priests play in the early weeks and months of the revolution. And at the Bastille, this storming of a place dank with chains, if the stories are to be believed, and the funerals that are given for those who had taken part in the storming of the Bastille, the text that is preached by the Archbishop of Paris comes from Paul. You, my brothers, were called to be free. And this is a sentiment that is perfectly in tune with the call to liberté in the revolution.
So, Tom, are you effectively saying, and some people, listeners may consider this the classic Holland gambit, that the ideological struggle within the French Revolution, of revolutions against counter-revolutions, is basically a struggle between two different kinds of Christians?
I am, and it's about the attempt, I think, of the revolution to appropriate much of its inheritance from the Christian past. And I think that's the other way of interpreting the Berbier's picture, is that it's not in any way saying that the Bible and the Enlightenment, Christ and Voltaire can be synthesized. It's saying that a revolutionary order has to appropriate what it can of previous revolutionary orders.
Yeah.
And the truth is that there is something distinctive, I think, about European society in the West that reaches right the way back beyond the Reformation, back to the 11th century, when Europe's primal revolution happens, where you have basically, it's the Catholic Church that is directed. You have a Pope who humbles kings. The humbling of kings is a vital part of the dynamics of what is going on in the 11th century. You have an emperor kneeling in the snow before a Pope. You have a notion that society itself is born again, bred new, can be washed in blood and emerge as something new. And it creates a kind of division within society that by the time of the revolution has been framed as being religious and secular.
Yeah.
And of course, the Catholic Church is the universal church. So that instinct on the part of the revolutionaries to preach universalism is a highly, deeply Christian one. And finally, just on the declaration that we began with, the Declaration of Human Rights, where did the idea come from? Then, if they're universal, they are not evident in antiquity. They are not evident in parts of the world beyond Latin Christendom. They emerge in the 12th century as a product of the kind of the cultural ferment of that first revolution in Italy in the 12th century. And that's where they come from. So if the revolution is to proclaim that these are universal and that the revolution embodies them, it needs to utterly incinerate and obliterate the memory of that. I think that what the revolution demonstrates is actually the one thing a revolutionary hates more than a reactionary is a rival revolution. And I think the hostility between the revolution as it will emerge over the course of the period that we've been talking about, so into the period of terror, is that the hostility of the revolution towards the Catholic Church is similar to the hostility that the Protestant reformers felt towards the papacy
And the rival church.
It's a rival. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Interesting. The Holland gambit never. So all of that, like I said, we'll get to the terror, specifically the revolution. But obviously, right from the start, to go back to the Declaration of Independence, that was what, August 1789? And right from that point, Louis and Marie Antoinette and the people who have not fled and stuck around, they don't like this.
Of course not, because it has implications for the monarchy as well as the church.
So Louis published a response to the Declaration in September. He said, yeah, I love the spirit of Elden Ring. And then he went through all the specifics and said, don't agree with that.
Yeah, so like the Serbian reply to the Austrian ultimatum.
Very good. Yeah, very good. And I think, for me, the obvious problem that they have with their constitution building and their desire to set France on a new sort of gear is that they have a huge hole in their central constitution, which is the king, because they've talked about British-style constitution. But is Louis going to play that part? And particularly once the church, which is sworn open, once that comes into the kind of fire, I don't think it's ever. He was saying throughout the way this can be reconciled. And he's ever going to adjust himself to this new world. And obviously, we're going to get back to the narrative. After his response to the declaration, that tension reached a climax, won't it? One of the most dramatic, exciting, tragic episodes of the entire revolution. And that's what we're doing tomorrow, Tom.
It is. It's the march, the Women's March on Versailles.
Oh, very exciting.
So we'll be looking at that, and we'll be looking at the way in which the revolution has to work. It's going to be about the world. So we'll get back to that tomorrow. Have a man.
Stuff. Au revoir. So Tom, this is the moment. It's one of the great set piece moments, not just in French history, but in European history, isn't it? It's the humiliation of King and Queen by this group, either of, you would say, of tender-hearted representatives of the people, or slavering beasts from the slums and sewers, depending, of course, on the way you view it. So the baker, Mrs. Baker, and the baker's boy, they're the king. Dauphin, what, 5? Something like that. Yeah, something like that. Very, very young. So they effectively, from this point onwards, are, if they're not weren't already, they are prisoners of the revolution, held in captivity. And this, you could argue, this is the great turning point in the story of the revolution.
I think certainly for the King and Queen, it's a much more significant turning point than the storming of the Bastille. And it's clearly a massive turning point in the history of the revolution, but you could equally argue that it is kind of drawing a line under a whole series of measures and developments that have been happening over the previous months. It's a kind of logical conclusion to what's been happening. So just to remind listeners of what those developments are. The Bastille stormed on the 14th of July, and then that August of 1789, you have the revocation of feudal privileges, where all the aristocrats and abbots and people stand up and renounce all their various perks. And that's passed on the 11th of August. And then on the 26th of August, their approval is given in the National Assembly for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is what we were talking about in yesterday's episode. But what we kind of briefly touched on but didn't really explore is the way that the Declaration of the Rights of Man, I mean, it kind of just on the ideological level, it raises as many questions as it answers. And there are definitely those in the National Assembly, but also more broadly in Paris, who feel it does not go far enough. So what we didn't talk about yesterday, but which I'm sure lots of our particularly female listeners will have been wondering, is what about the rights of women and the citizeness? And that is a topic that we'll be looking at later. Essentially, there is quite, I think, a kind of misogynist tone to revolutionary zeal.
Well, all the stuff about virtue and virility has been laying the ground for that, right? They always talk about the oath of the Horatii, the great Romans, but they're always talking about men, never about women.
Yes, and although women do play a key part in this story, they tend to be a kind of anonymous mass. That is how they're celebrated, not as individuals. Also, the other kind of burning question, then as now, what about slaves? The French own huge plantations. They say liberty for all, but equally they say property rights must be respected. So there is an unresolved tension there. Cause. But of course, more immediately for the future of France's constitution, what about the monarchy? Because how is the role of the king to be squared with the ideals of liberty? So yesterday we were looking at the church, but I mean, in a way, the king is an even bigger roadblock to that idea of a single nation, a single patrie.
Because as we were saying before, a lot of these revolutions are inspired by Montesquieu's ideas about sort of a mixed constitution, separation of powers, and the idea of the British constitution. The modern system, Mirabeau, a great sort of figure in the assembly at this point. He's all about a British-style monarchy, isn't he? And they need something to play that part. They're not talking about, at this point, a republican democracy. So they need, they want a king-shaped whole, and they want a king, a patriot king, to fit it.
They do. So Mirabeau is from the hero of the revolution, who seems to have patriot, but he is allying himself with kind of nobles who are less motivated by revolutionary fervor. So they are literally the metropolitan elite.
Yeah. These
are nobles from Paris, very rich, very highly educated, and who are fascinated by the British example. So the fascination with England as a model has been a trend running throughout the 18th century. Even France has been forward. And so Mirabeau and these kind of metropolitan nobles are proposing in the National Assemblies, they've got a kind of constitutional committee set up to ponder these issues. They're saying that we should model our constitution on British practice, and although they are very, very careful to point out that their version will be better than the British one because they will learn from the British example.
No such version exists, even in theory.
You might think that. So what they're proposing is an elected National Assembly, which would correspond to the House of Commons, a Senate, which would be drawn from the great and good, and obviously corresponds to the House of Lords. And this Senate, initially they wanted to be for life, and then there are kind of objections to this, and so they say, well, it could be for 6 years. So drawing on the American exemplar. As you say, they want the king to play the part that the British king plays. And essentially the British king, with the Glorious Revolution hanging over his or her head, the sense that the king who doesn't play his part will be kicked out. The British king has the power of veto over all legislation. Essentially, it's very, very simple. And I think that is what they want. They want someone who will have the power of veto, because that will, kind of provide a check on what they would see as excesses of popular fervour. At the same time, they need a king who will not be too ready to use it. And the question is Louis XVI qualified to play that role? So that's one issue. But the other issue facing the monarchians is the fact that there are lots of radical deputies in the Assembly who view any the king having any veto. That's an absolute out.
Yeah, and there are lots out there who. One difference between as it were, the British Revolution, if you want to call it that, which nobody ever does, and the French Revolution is in Britain. The idea of the separation of powers, as in the United States, is seen as incredibly healthy and organic and necessary check and balance. But in France, you now have this sort of romantic fervour, the idea of la nation, and the assembly reflecting the general will of the nation. So there are lots of people who say, well, why would we divide it up? We've just done away with different borders.
The 3 estates have been sorted up. Exactly. So why then? Because essentially, you have an assembly of great and good. That means bishops, it means aristocrats. So you can understand the suspicion. So the Abbé de Sieyes, who we met early on in the kind of the debate around the 3 estates at Versailles, he describes the whole proposal as a lettre de cachet launched against the national will, against the entire nation. So comparing it to a kind of unjust monarchical repression of liberty.
And that idea of the national will, quite a dangerous idea, you might say, in the long run.
Well, but also the idea that sovereignty resides in the nation, which is one of the key principles of the Declaration of Rights. And if that is the case, then how can any individual, even the king, stand against the sovereignty of the nation? And it's a real problem, and it results in the National Assembly essentially kind of splitting into rival factions. And what happens is that the monarchiens, the enthusiasts for the kind of British style constitution, start to congregate on the right side of the meeting hall, and their opponents, those who want a more radical solution, on the left. And Dominic, that's a division that we still see stamped on
Yeah,
politics
left and right. Absolutely.
to this very day.
But actually, they reach a kind of compromise, don't they? So this is what, September 1789. They reject a second chamber.
That's decisively rejected, and the Constitutional Committee, which is full of all these kind of political elite types, that gets dissolved. So that's clearly a victory for the more radical wing. But you're right, around the veto, there is a kind of compromise that doesn't really satisfy anyone. So the king is allowed a veto, but it's a suspensive one. So it's a bit like the House of Lords in what was it, 19
In Asquith.
10 or
It's great to get Asquith back on the show, in Asquith's Britain. So yeah, the House of Lords can postpone legislation or sort of block it, but then basically the Commons can break the logjam and under the Parliament Act. Yeah. So the King can veto legislation 3 times, and then basically if they bring it
which
back
I think
again,
effectively means 2 years.
right.
So he has a 2-year block
Okay.
on
And then if they
legislation.
come back and say no, we still want it, he then can't resist it, which actually to me seems quite a good, it's a safety valve. It's a cooling off period.
But the right wing don't like it because it makes it impossible to preserve a kind of genuine balance of powers.
Yeah.
That's very important to them, and it doesn't satisfy the radicals because the king can still frustrate the will of the sovereign people.
Yeah.
So both sides are kind of cross. But there's also, I think, by this point, a sense that what people in the National Assembly think is not necessarily decisive, because there is also the will of the people as expressed by the inhabitants of Paris. And in Paris, people don't understand the veto at all. They kind of think it's a new tax, lots of them. And even those who don't, they don't really know what it is, but they're against it. That's the bottom line. And this is driven, I think, by, first of all, a kind of growing sense of hostility to the king personally. And this is fostered by the fact that he has been notably silent about the repudiation of feudalism and the Declaration of Rights.
Yeah.
And I think we said in the previous episode, and then on the 19th of September he does finally comment on this kind of repudiation of feudal rights, but he hedges it around with so many qualifications that it ends up sounding like he's actually rejecting it. And the deputies are very upset about this, and in Paris everyone is absolutely furious. And then on the 4th of October he voices reservations about the Declaration of Rights.
Yeah.
And I suppose the king would say, well, why shouldn't I have a king? but in the context of a liberty-loving people with sovereignty, this is dangerous. And I think also there is a sense in Paris that the National Assembly itself is compromised by its willingness to treat the king. And there's talk that they will move it to from Versailles, the Paris region, to Tours, the city of the Loire. Famously royalist, and therefore get that across they're not in favour of that at all. And the other thing that's through in September, which everyone knows is incredibly problematic, both for those who are starving and those who are thinking of things that are in France, is the fact that the price of bread is starting to go up again. So it had declined kind of in early August, but it's now going up. And this isn't because it's terrible weather. The weather's very good. The grain is ripening. It's kind of ready to be harvested. But the problem is that the weather is so good that all the mills have been immobilized because there's no water in the rivers. So you start to get bread riots, you get demands for higher wages, and you get these familiar accusations, which the Marquis de Sade makes such play with in his novels, that the king and the aristocracy are deliberately trying to starve the revolution to death.
So it's a useful reminder, isn't it, that there are these 2 different dimensions to the revolution. So on the one hand, there's the dimension of kind of politics and ideas and everything that's going on in the National Assembly as people are moving into their different factions left and right. And then outside, none of that would have the salience, it wouldn't be so charged, were it not for the fact that outside there are people starving. There is a real anger on the streets, isn't there? And the danger, the huge danger for the authors of the revolution is that they have maybe what could they do about it? But they have allowed people they've given people the impression that changes to the political and financial kind of structure will magically transform the situation in the streets and mean that bread prices fall and all that kind of thing. And actually, a lot of them have no, they're what we would call neoliberals. They have no intention of fixing the price of bread and helping people out of these kinds of ways.
Yeah, because May's radical conservative.
Exactly. Yeah.
Things are moving so fast. So there's a sense that lots of deputies are kind of running very fast up the atmosphere, just trying to avoid being chewed up by the revolution. And this is turbocharged by the fact, of course, that the Declaration of Rights has officially abolished censorship, and that means that there's basically nothing the authorities can do to restrain expressions of hostility, whether it's to the King or the National Assembly or whoever. And there is a particular newspaper which is launched on the 12th of September against the backdrop of all these fails, which really, really demonstrates how potent journalism can now be. And this is a paper, it's not its original name, its ultimate name is L'Ami du Peuple, so the people's friend. And its editor is a man called Jean-Paul Marat, who is, he's kind of drifted from job to job. He's someone who's never really held down a secure position. He's a scientist, he's a physician, he's a political theorist. Actually, for a while, a bit like our Goldhanger stablemate Alan Shearer.
Yeah, actually very similar.
He lived in Newcastle.
It's very similar. I've often thought that.
Except that, unlike Alan Shearer, Alan Shearer never ended up physician to the bodyguard Doctor.
Alan Shearer also, I'll say what you like about Alan Shearer, he's got lovely skin. And Marat has terrible skin.
Marat does have absolutely terrible skin, yes. And also he's never written a paper on the gonorrhea of one of his friends.
As far as you know, Tom.
As far as I know.
You don't know about what he's been up to. Any Craig Bellamy or Les Ferdinand or any of his Newcastle statements.
So Marat comes back from St James' to Paris.
Yeah.
And he's kind of drifting around, he's built a farm. He's the classic example. The underpaid intellectual, the undervalued intellectual is always the great driver of revolutions. And Marat's a kind of classic example. And he finds in the revolution and the chance to edit his paper, The Human Frame, absolutely everything that he's ever been made is completely his vocation. And essentially he is brilliant at blaming everything on conspiracies, on plots, on attempts by sinister figures to destroy the people. So he calls his enemies bloodsuckers, very much the language of vampirism. And while the deputies in the National Assembly are trying to sort the Constitution out, he's piling in full kind of angry person on Twitter.
Yeah.
So open your eyes, shake off your lethargy, purge your committees, preserve only the healthy members, sweep away the corrupt, the royal pensioners and the devious aristocrats, intriguers and false patriots. You have nothing to expect from them except servitude, poverty, and desolation.
Marat's such a familiar figure because he's that person who suddenly sees a loser, basically, a drifter, as you said, and he suddenly, in the chaos of the revolution, sees his opportunity to make a name for himself by this unbelievably ferocious invective. I mean, we do see people like it today, don't we?
So there's a sense in which this is alien. I think it's not too much of an anachronism to call them centrists. People who initially have been in favour of the revolution and now with this kind of ever more radical language are starting to think, oh, hold on. So often these are foreign admirers of the revolution. So there's an English visitor in Paris who'd come there because he was kind of so excited by what was going on, who is following these kind of attacks on the National Assembly, and he writes, woe be to the legislature that employs a senseless profligate rabble to enforce its laws. Lanterns are arguments in this country, so lanterns you sling the rope over and hang your enemies.
Yeah, lynching.
Maybe lynching, yes. And so there you have opposed senses of where sovereignty should lie. does the people's sovereignty lie on the streets, or does it lie in kind of constitutional forms? And this is the great question the revolution is kind of focusing on. And it results in a kind of as in early July, so September, October, a kind of a sense of potential violence directed now, not just against the royal family, but also against the National Assembly, both of whom, of course, are in Versailles. And even in August, you had a kind of an aristocrat who'd been imprisoned in Charenton, where the Marquis de Sade is. So the kind of the Sade equality quite a lot. That's quite fascinating. But anyway, so this was a Marquis, and he proposed a march on Versailles. That had kind of fizzled out. But in the Palais Royal, which is this kind of great centre of free speech owned by the Duke of Orleans, husband of Louis XVI, lots of radical circles are saying we should organise a coup, we should march on Versailles, we should get the royal family. And essentially the city feels that it's poised between further expressions of revolutionary fervour or counter-revolution. And this is for those who are in charge of keeping this in place, stopping riots breaking out. This is a nightmare because
well, this is the question, right? Why don't the authorities? I mean, they have money, they have armed men. Why don't they in some way clamp down and try and police this?
Well, for starters, as I said, the issue around censorship. They can't control what is now happening. So, as in the 60s, revolution has bred freedom of speech, turn activities. So that's one part of it. But the other thing is that if you were saying that structures of power are movements and expressions of kind of blood-sucking vampirism, it's very difficult to take charge of them. So all of those have been erased. The Bastille has gone, the Lettres Cachées has gone, all of that. So essentially, in a very kind of Orwellian step, the revolutionaries find that they have to resurrect what they have eliminated.
And it's interesting they're doing this so early, right? In 1789. So within just a few couple of months, really, of the fall of the Bastille, at the end of that summer, in the autumn, they're already thinking we have to bring back, what do they call it? The search committee. So they're opening letters and doing all that kind of thing.
Yeah, so Sharma in Citizens describes it as the first organ of a revolutionary police state. And essentially it takes for itself all the powers of the Ancien Regime that everyone had condemned. So they can open letters, they can sponsor spies, they can search houses without warrants, they can even prison people who are suspected of being a danger to the revolution without trial. Basically, the whole Lettres Cachées system. So that's one aspect of it. You've got kind of the development of a kind of proto-secret police commanded by Lafayette, and it's his job essentially to maintain order in the capital. But he's finding it increasingly struggling because he's about 10. He's got all these terrible. I mean, basically, he's coping with a situation that no one wants.
Well, you and I disagree about that, don't we? I think if he'd been, a man of great cold-blooded ruthlessness, he would have seized this opportunity and really made a name for himself. But he's a bit of a diddler, do you think it's fair to say? He feels himself caught between different...
I look at him much more favourably. I think that he is, his enthusiasm for the revolution is not a counter-revolutionary, and he is struggling with a situation that no one has faced before.
Well, actually, see what somebody has faced this before, and later on, as we will see in this episode,
so maybe
compare him with an English predecessor, and if he'd had anything like the backbone and the spirit of that English predecessor, he'd one day have been Lord Protector of France, but it wasn't to be.
Possibly. Anyway, so September turns to October, capital's getting ever more ready to kind of blow up, price of bread is going up, and then on the 2nd of October, details of a scandal in Versailles arrives in Paris, and again talking about how important details of royal scandals are in affecting the course of events. And this is seen as an absolute shocker. So Marat is all over it. The people's friend, he loves this. And the story goes that the king has summoned a regiment from the northeast frontier, the Flanders regiment. They've arrived at Versailles, and his bodyguard have staged a banquet for them. And staging a banquet at a time when people in Paris are starving seems to be very offensive anyway. But this banquet is supposedly degenerated into an orgy sponsored by the Queen.
Yeah.
And on top of it all the participants in this banquet are supposed to have taken the revolutionary bouquet, so the trampling underfoot, and the Queen is said to approve them. And in Paris, this is seen as a kind of blasphemy, and it turbocharges all the old rules that the Queen, her depravity, her inherent qualities, her desire to starve the poor of Paris to death.
But it combines two different conspiracy theories, really, doesn't it? One is the thing about Marie which you mentioned, but the other is all through the summer and the autumn, people have been anxious about the arrival of troops from the frontiers, the German-speaking troops in particular. So the Flanders regiment, for the idea that these people turned up, they're the vanguard of the counter-revolution, they're in league with the bloodsuckers in the court. I mean, it could not be a better gift to something like that.
Yeah, and it spreads terror throughout the poorest quarters in Paris. On the morning of 5th October, very early, a masked woman, she stands up, she addresses all the other women who are starting to gather for the day's market, and she harangues them, saying that the fact that they can't afford to get bread, can't afford to put food on the family's tables, that this is due to the Queen, due to the vampires of Versailles, and they should march on the hands and, well, who knows what, but what happens, Dominic, will change the face of France forever.
What drama, Tom!
So that morning, Marie Antoinette is in her little model village, the Petit Trianon. She's been feeding her ducks, feeding her goldfish, and then she's been left a bit tired by this, and so she retires to a grotto for a little rest.
Oh, that's nice. Bucolic.
So, her husband, the king, has been out shooting. Normally he would have gone hunting, but he is aware that trouble is brewing in Paris, and so by going shooting, it means that it's easy to contact him should developments happen. And he has a very successful day shooting, and in his journal he notes killed 81 head.
A poor show by the standards of Franz Ferdinand and George V.
Certainly by the standards, absolutely. But I think not bad for a morning.
Yeah, that's the difference between the Austrians and the French, isn't it? The Austrians are so ruthless.
Well, that's certainly what the mobs in Paris would say when they talk about Marie Antoinette. And of course, both of these activities are absolutely calculated to infuriate virtuous patriots, because Marie Antoinette playing with her animals in the Petit Trianon, I mean, this will become, in a way, the defining image of her, the kind of the role playing, the seen as feckless. I mean, we talked about how I think Marie Antoinette sees it as an expression of her sympathy with the poor, but this is not how the poor themselves see it. And the king going shooting, again, this is kind of deliberately offensive, because as one of the feudal privileges jettisoned is the right that the nobility had to go shooting. And so with the abolition of the feudal monopolies on hunting and shooting, basically every bird in France is being wiped out. So you may complain that the king hasn't been shooting enough birds, but I mean, all over France it's just bang, bang, bang. And our old friend Arthur Young, the Englishman who's been travelling across France and Germany for the popular series, he's in remorse when suddenly it becomes legal for people to go out shooting. Because I've been pestered with all the modern country shooting. One would think that every rusty gun is involved, killing all sorts of birds. The shot has fallen 5 or 6 times in my chase and about my ears. So that's something that hasn't changed. But you know, Dominic, this is the last time the KO will have the option of choosing whether to go shooting or hunting.
Sad day.
The last time that the Queen didn't get to feed her ducks.
The ducks and the rivers. Probably ended up being easy by some lot. Yeah.
So, as Louis notes in his journal, interrupted by a bailiff. And that, of course, was shooting.
Yeah.
So, 10 o'clock in the morning, Marianne is reposing in the grotto when she is informed that an armed force has left Paris and is moving to Versailles.
And brilliantly, she's informed by her hairdresser. Is that right? Monsieur Leonard, who is the sort of the metrosexual friend of Marianne, isn't he?
Yes, well, that's what he later said. It has to be said that it's uncorroborated by anyone else.
Right.
But yes, he coming to the rescue of his diva friend. Tricky to get in touch with Lucy at shootings, but they find him and he's back by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there's a meeting of the Royal Council. And they don't know what to do. And there is this traffic, perhaps the King and Queen should front her head for somewhere secure. But what's fascinating is that even at this stage,